Ethan Brooks walked out of the interview room knowing he'd just killed his only chance, not because he lacked the skills. The hiring panel had been impressed until they learned the truth. A janitor applying for a desk job. No degree, no pedigree. Just a widowed father desperate enough to believe competence might matter more than appearances. When the tone shifted from interested to dismissive, he could have pleaded, could have explained the medical bills, the overnight shifts, the years of invisible excellence. Instead, he stood, thanked them for their time, and chose dignity over desperation. Behind him, a billionaire CEO was watching everything. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button so I can see how far Ethan's story travels. Now, let's begin where most stories would end, with a man walking away from his last hope. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency Ethan Brooks had learned to tune out years ago. They were the same lights that had illuminated countless midnight shifts, the same lights that had witnessed him push a mop cart past empty conference rooms where decisions about futures were made by people who never saw him coming or going. But now, sitting in one of those conference rooms for the first time during daylight hours, those lights felt different, accusatory almost, as if they knew he didn't belong here on this side of visibility. The interview had started well, too well perhaps. That should have been his first warning. Your experience with facility management is quite extensive, the woman across the table had said, her eyes scanning the resume that Ethan had spent 3 evenings perfecting at the public library. Her name was Patricia Hemsworth, and her title, Senior Director of Human Capital, was the kind of phrase that made simple things sound important. Beside her sat 2 other members of the hiring panel, their expressions professionally neutral, their hands folded over leather portfolios that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. "Thank you," Ethan had replied, keeping his voice steady, professional. He'd practiced this. In the bathroom mirror after his son fell asleep, he'd rehearsed responses until they sounded natural instead of desperate. "I've been with Donovan Industries for 6 years. In that time, I've managed emergency situations, coordinated with multiple departments, and maintained consistent performance standards even during high-pressure periods." All true. Every word of it. He just left out the part about doing all of that with a mop in his hand and a name tag no one ever read. Patricia had smiled then, the kind of smile that temporarily convinced you that the world might actually reward hard work. That's exactly the kind of reliability we need for our front desk operations. The position requires someone who can handle unexpected situations with composure, someone who understands the flow of this building. "I understand it very well," Ethan had said, and the understatement had almost made him laugh. He knew every floor, every corner, every room where executives held meetings at 2 in the morning because a crisis in Tokyo didn't care about New York business hours. He knew which floors had temperamental heating systems, which bathrooms needed the special plunger, which conference rooms were used for celebrations and which were used for terminations. He knew this building the way a ship captain knows every deck and bulkhead. The man to Patricia's left, Gerald something, his name tag had read, had leaned forward with interest. 6 years is considerable tenure. What prompted you to pursue this position now? This was the moment Ethan had worried about. The moment where the truth became complicated. He'd chosen honesty anyway, because lies had a way of becoming traps, and he'd spent enough of his life feeling trapped. "My current position doesn't offer the benefits package I need," he'd said carefully. "I have a 7-year-old son with a chronic health condition. The medical coverage for this role would allow me to provide him with the care he deserves, and the schedule—" He'd paused, weighing his words. "The schedule would allow me to be present for him in ways my current position doesn't permit." All of that was true too. What he hadn't said was that his current schedule was 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week, with occasional overtime when the building hosted events. That he sometimes fell asleep sitting up at his son's bedside because lying down meant he might not wake up for pickup at school. That the health insurance for janitorial staff was catastrophically expensive and covered almost nothing, which meant every doctor's visit was a calculation of which bills could be delayed to pay for it. Patricia had nodded with what seemed like understanding. "Family is important. We value employees who prioritize both their professional and personal responsibilities." The woman to Patricia's right had spoken up then, her voice crisp and efficient. "Your resume shows extensive experience in facility operations and crisis management, but I don't see any formal education listed. Could you speak to your training background? And there it was. The question Ethan had known was coming, but had hoped somehow wouldn't matter. I don't have a college degree, he'd admitted, keeping his chin level, his voice clear. I enlisted in the military straight out of high school, served 4 years, received training in logistics and operations management. After my discharge, I worked in private security for 2 years before joining Donovan Industries. He'd watched their faces as he spoke, watched the subtle shift in their expressions, the micro adjustments in posture that people make when they've already started categorizing you differently than they had a moment before. I see, Patricia had said, and those 2 words contained volumes. And your current role at Donovan Industries, could you elaborate on your specific responsibilities? This was it, the moment of truth that would become the moment of ending. I'm a facilities maintenance technician, Ethan had said, using the official job title that sounded better than what everyone actually called it. Night shift operations. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like water fills a sinking ship. A janitor, Gerald had said finally, not quite making it a question. Facilities maintenance technician, Ethan had corrected quietly, but they all knew it didn't matter what words you wrapped around it. A janitor was a janitor, and janitors didn't become front desk staff at billion-dollar corporations, no matter how well they understood the flow of the building. Patricia had recovered her professional composure quickly. Mr. Brooks, we appreciate your interest in advancing within Donovan Industries. That kind of ambition is admirable. However, the front desk position is a public-facing role that requires... She'd paused, searching for the phrase that would sound reasonable instead of discriminatory. A certain presentation. Our clients and partners expect to be greeted by someone who reflects the company's professional image. I understand professional presentation, Ethan had said, keeping his voice level, even as something hot and angry coiled in his chest. I wear a uniform to work every day. I maintain grooming standards. I interact professionally with every person I encounter, regardless of their position. Of course, Patricia had said quickly. We're not questioning your professionalism. It's simply that this particular role requires a background more traditionally aligned with client services. Perhaps if you pursued some additional education, earned a degree in business administration or hospitality management, you could reapply in the future. Go to school. Take on student debt you can barely afford when you're already drowning in medical bills. Spend years studying things you already know how to do. Prove you deserve a chance to do a job you could start tomorrow. Maybe then we'll consider seeing you as a person instead of a problem. Ethan had felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling back over his shoulders like a cloak. He'd been foolish to think it might have lifted. 6 years of arriving after everyone left, leaving before anyone arrived. 6 years of being the person who made everything clean and functional without anyone noticing it was being done by a person at all. 6 years of watching people walk past him as if he were part of the furniture, or worse, as if he were a problem to be ignored. He'd thought about his son, about Marcus, with his bright eyes and his wheeze that got worse when the weather changed, and the inhaler that cost $90 even with the discount program from the pharmacy. About the hospital bills that arrived like clockwork, their red past due stamps, a constant reminder that he was failing at the most basic requirement of parenthood, keeping your child healthy. He'd thought about the nights he'd spent in this building, maintaining order in spaces where people made decisions about millions of dollars. About the time he'd found a senior VP passed out in a bathroom and had stayed with him, called for help, waited until the ambulance came even though it meant he'd be late finishing his rounds. About the time he'd noticed smoke coming from a storage room and had handled it calmly, efficiently, preventing what could have been a catastrophic fire. About the countless small moments where his competence, his calm under pressure, his attention to detail had kept this building running smoothly. None of that mattered. Not to these people sitting across from him with their leather portfolios and their polite phrases that meant, "You're not what we want to see when we walk through the door." Gerald had cleared his throat. We do appreciate your 6 years of service to Donovan Industries. Your work hasn't gone unnoticed. That was a lie. His work had absolutely gone unnoticed. That was the entire problem. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Patricia had asked, in the tone of someone who was already moving on to the next item on their agenda. Ethan had looked at each of them in turn, had seen the decision already made, the door already closed. He could have pleaded, Could have laid out the details of his life in terms designed to create sympathy. Could have explained that this wasn't about ambition or advancement. It was about survival, about insurance that might actually help his son breathe easier, about a schedule that meant he could be at school events and doctor's appointments, about finally, after 6 years, being seen as something more than a shadow that cleaned up after people who mattered. But he was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of the calculation that said his years of reliable service meant less than a piece of paper from a college he'd never been able to afford. Tired of the subtle message that some work made you a person worth seeing and some work made you a problem to be politely dismissed. And more than tired, he was done accepting that message. "No," Ethan had said, standing up slowly, gathering his dignity around him like armor. "I think you've made your position clear. Thank you for your time." Patricia had looked slightly taken aback, as if she'd expected him to push harder, as if people in his position were supposed to be grateful just for the opportunity to be rejected in a conference room. "We'll be making our decision by the end of the week. We have several other candidates to consider." "I understand," Ethan had said. "I hope you find someone who fits your image requirements." There had been a moment where Patricia's professional mask had slipped, where she'd looked almost uncomfortable. Good, Ethan had thought. Let her feel a fraction of what I'm feeling. He'd walked to the door with his spine straight and his head up, refusing to let them see him break. Had thanked them again because his mother had raised him with manners, even if the world hadn't raised him with fairness. Had closed the door behind him with a gentle click that felt like the sound of every door that had ever closed in his face. The hallway outside was bright and clean, its floors polished to a mirror shine. Ethan knew exactly which cleaning solution created that particular gleam, knew the specific technique required to achieve it. He'd trained 3 different people on how to maintain these floors properly. None of the people walking past him now knew that. To them, he was just another man in a tie that didn't fit quite right, probably heading to a job he was barely qualified for. Ethan made his way to the elevator, pushed the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended, he watched the numbers light up and fade, counting down from 20 to 1, and thought about how easily years of work could be reduced to a number that decreased until it disappeared entirely. The lobby was busy with the afternoon rush of people leaving early, heading to meetings at other buildings, conducting business that required them to be visible and valued. Ethan wove through them carefully, an invisible current moving against the flow. He was halfway to the exit when he heard his name. "Mr. Brooks." The voice was clear and commanding, cutting through the ambient noise of the lobby like a bell. Ethan turned, confused, and saw Patricia hurrying after him, her professional composure slightly disrupted by the physical exertion of moving quickly in heels. "Yes?" Ethan said, allowing himself a small, bitter hope that perhaps she'd reconsidered, that perhaps someone had reminded her that competence wasn't measured in degrees or appearances. Patricia reached him, slightly breathless. "I wanted to catch you before you left. About the position." She paused, and Ethan watched her recalibrate her words. "I wanted to thank you for your understanding. I know these situations can be disappointing, but I think you'll find that with some additional education, doors will open for you. You're clearly hardworking. That's valuable." Hardworking. The consolation prize of people who had no intention of actually rewarding the work. "Thank you," Ethan said flatly. "I'll keep that in mind." "I do mean it," Patricia said, and she sounded sincere. That was somehow worse. "You've been a reliable employee. That counts for something." But not enough, Ethan thought. Never enough. "I appreciate that," he said, because what else could he say? That her appreciation was worthless without action? That reliable was just another word for useful enough to keep around but not valuable enough to promote? He turned back toward the exit, ready to push through the glass doors and out into the afternoon air, where he could finally stop holding himself together. Ethan Brooks. This voice was different, sharper, carrying an authority that made people in the lobby turn to look, without even realizing they were doing it. Ethan froze. He knew that voice, had heard it occasionally echo through the building during late-night emergency meetings, calm and decisive even at 3 a.m. Had heard it once directly when she'd walked past him in the hallway and said, "Thank you for keeping this place running," in a tone that suggested she actually meant it. He turned slowly, almost afraid to confirm what he already knew. Claire Donovan was walking toward him across the lobby floor, her stride purposeful and unhurried, her expression focused entirely on him as if he were the only person in the entire building. The CEO of Donovan Industries, the woman whose signature was on every policy, whose decisions shaped the careers of thousands of employees, the billionaire whose face appeared in business magazines with headlines about innovation and market dominance and leadership philosophy. She was walking toward him, toward Ethan Brooks, the night shift janitor who'd just been politely dismissed from a job interview for being exactly who he was. The lobby had gone noticeably quieter. People were watching without being obvious about it, their conversations continuing but their attention diverted. This was the kind of moment that became office gossip, the kind of scene that people described later with the phrase, "You won't believe what I saw." Patricia had gone pale. "Miss Donovan," she said, her voice carrying a mix of surprise and apprehension. "I wasn't aware you were in the building," Claire finished, her eyes not leaving Ethan's face. "I'm often in the building, Patricia. I find it's useful to know what's actually happening in my company." She stopped a few feet from Ethan, and he found himself meeting her gaze directly. She was younger than he'd thought, probably early 40s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to process information faster than most people could deliver it. She was wearing what he'd learned to recognize as an expensive suit, the kind where the quality was in the details invisible to anyone who couldn't afford to care about such things. "Mr. Brooks," Claire said, and her voice was level, professional, but carrying an undercurrent of something Ethan couldn't quite identify. "I owe you an apology." Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry?" "An apology," Claire repeated, "for what just happened in that interview room, for the fact that it took me walking past to realize what was occurring, for the reality that you've worked in this building for 6 years and I never ensured you were being seen properly." Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the polished floor. "Ms. Donovan, I'm not sure I understand." "Don't you?" Claire's attention shifted to Patricia, and Ethan watched the temperature in the immediate vicinity drop several degrees. "You just conducted an interview where you told a highly qualified internal candidate that he didn't fit our professional image, where you suggested he pursue years of additional education before we might consider him worthy of answering phones and greeting clients. Would you like to explain to me what part of that reflects Donovan Industries' stated values of promoting from within and recognizing merit over credentials?" "With respect, Ms. Donovan," Patricia said carefully, "the front desk position requires specific qualifications. Mr. Brooks lacks the educational background and the client services experience." "Mr. Brooks," Claire interrupted, "prevented a potential lawsuit and probably saved a man's life approximately 18 months ago. Do you remember that incident, Patricia?" Patricia looked blank. "I'm not sure." "Of course you don't remember it," Claire said. "It happened at 2:30 in the morning. David Chen, one of our key partners from the Singapore office, had a severe allergic reaction during late-night contract negotiations. Mr. Brooks found him, recognized the symptoms, administered his EpiPen, and stayed with him until the paramedics arrived. He did this calmly, efficiently, and without making a single mistake. David Chen has specifically mentioned that incident 3 times in my presence, praising the professionalism and composure of our staff." Ethan felt heat rising in his face. He'd almost forgotten about that night. It had just been part of the job. Someone needed help. He provided it. He hadn't expected anyone to remember, certainly hadn't expected anyone to care. "I didn't realize," Patricia began. "You didn't realize because you never asked," Claire said bluntly. "You looked at a resume that said facilities maintenance and made assumptions. You saw someone who cleans this building and decided he couldn't possibly have the skills to represent it." The position requirements. Gerald had appeared, drawn by the commotion, and was attempting to defend the decision. "The position requirements," Claire cut him off, "are written by people who value appearances over ability. Mr. Brooks has demonstrated crisis management skills, professional composure, comprehensive knowledge of our operations, and reliability over 6 years of service. What he lacks is a piece of paper that proves he sat in classrooms for 4 years. Please explain to me why one matters more than the other." Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no good answer to that question, and they all knew it. Claire turned back to Ethan, and her expression softened slightly. "I'm not doing this as a gesture, Mr. Brooks. I'm doing this because I watched that interview on the security feed in my office. I watched you handle yourself with professionalism and dignity, even as you were being dismissed for circumstances that have nothing to do with your capability. And I recognized you because I make it my business to know who actually keeps this company running." She paused, then added quietly, "I also know you have a son, Marcus, age 7, asthma, among other concerns. I know because I sign off on the healthcare expenses that our current insurance doesn't cover for our facilities staff, and I've seen your name on those reports multiple times." Ethan felt something crack in his chest. She knew. She'd known all along, and she'd never said anything, but she'd known. "That's private information," Patricia said weakly. "It's information I need to know to make informed decisions about how we structure our benefits and compensate our employees," Claire replied. "Mr. Brooks shouldn't have to choose between doing work he's qualified for and having insurance that keeps his child healthy. The fact that we've created that situation is a failure on our part, not his." She looked directly at Ethan again. "I'm not going to offer you that front desk position." Ethan's brief hope collapsed. Of course, even this would end in, "I'm going to offer you something better," Claire continued. "A position in our executive services training program. Paid training, full benefits starting immediately, and a clear advancement path based on performance rather than credentials. You'll rotate through different departments, learn the systems properly, and prove what you're capable of. At the end of 6 months, if you meet the performance standards, you'll be placed in a position that actually uses your skills." She tilted her head slightly. "It won't be easy. The other people in the program will have degrees and connections and advantages you don't. You'll have to work harder to prove yourself, but you'll be given an actual chance, not a polite dismissal dressed up as advice." Ethan stared at her. "Why?" The word came out rougher than he'd intended. "Why now? Why me?" "Because 18 months ago, you saved a man's life and went back to mopping floors without expecting anything," Claire said simply. "Because every report I've ever seen about facilities operations mentions your reliability and professionalism. Because I've made a career out of identifying talent that other people overlook, and I'm tired of watching my own company waste it. And because—" She paused, something crossing her face that looked almost like old anger. "Because I started in this company 20 years ago as an assistant to an assistant, and I had to fight 3 times as hard to get half the recognition given to people with the right last names and the right degrees. I know exactly what it's like to be qualified and invisible. I won't perpetuate that system if I have the power to change it." The lobby had gone completely silent now. This wasn't just office gossip anymore. This was a story that would be repeated and embellished and turned into company legend. Ethan looked at Patricia, whose face was a study in professional panic, looked at Gerald, who was trying to blend into the background, looked back at Claire Donovan, who was offering him something he'd stopped believing existed, a genuine chance. "I can't afford to fail," he said quietly. "My son depends on me. If I take this and can't make it work—" "Then you'll still have your current position," Claire said. "I'm not asking you to risk your job. I'm asking you to risk being seen. That's a different calculation." Risk being seen. After 6 years of being invisible, of accepting it as the cost of survival, she was asking him to step into light that could reveal all his inadequacies, to be measured not just on whether he could do the work, but on whether he could prove he deserved to do it. Ethan thought about Marcus wheezing in his sleep, the inhaler on the nightstand a constant reminder of vulnerability. Thought about the bills that he juggled like a circus performer, always one unexpected expense away from collapse. Thought about the question his son had asked last week with heartbreaking simplicity. "Dad, why don't you work during the day like other parents?" He thought about walking out of this building, going home to his apartment, explaining to his son that he'd tried and it hadn't worked, and watching that small face try to hide disappointment. And then he thought about what it would mean to try again. To step forward into uncertainty with the fragile hope that this time competence might actually be recognized, that this time the door might actually stay open. "When would I start?" Ethan asked. Claire smiled, and it transformed her face from intimidating to almost warm. "Monday, report to Human Resources at 8 a.m. Patricia will ensure all the paperwork is expedited." She glanced at Patricia with an expression that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "Won't you, Patricia?" "Of course, Ms. Donovan," Patricia said, her voice carefully neutral. I'll handle it personally. Good, Claire said. She extended her hand to Ethan. Welcome to Executive Services, Mr. Brooks. Don't make me regret believing you can handle this. Ethan shook her hand, feeling the firm grip, the calluses that suggested she'd done her share of hard work despite the executive title. I won't, he said, and meant it with every atom of his being. I know, Claire replied. Then, almost as an afterthought, and Mr. Brooks, when you start on Monday, come through the front door, not the service entrance. You work here. Act like it. She walked away, her stride returning to its purposeful pace, conversations resuming around her like water flowing around a stone. Within seconds, she disappeared into an elevator, leaving behind a lobby full of people who would be processing what they'd just witnessed for days. Ethan stood there, his hands still tingling from the handshake, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once. Patricia was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, resentment, maybe, mixed with a grudging respect. Gerald had already vanished, probably to begin whatever damage control he thought was necessary. Mr. Brooks, Patricia said finally, her voice tight, I'll need you to come back to HR to complete some additional paperwork. Now? Ethan asked. Yes, she said. If you have the time. Ethan almost laughed. If he had the time. As if he had anything more important to do than ensure this miraculous opportunity was secured on paper before something happened to make it evaporate like a dream upon waking. I have the time, he said. The paperwork took 2 hours. Patricia was professionally thorough, going through every form with explanations that bordered on over-detailed, as if she were documenting everything in case it later became relevant. Ethan didn't care. He signed where she indicated, initialed where required, provided information with a patience born from years of dealing with bureaucracy that treated your time as if it had no value. When it was finally finished, when the folder was thick with documents that outlined his new reality, Patricia looked at him across her desk with an expression that had moved from professional panic to something more complex. Mr. Brooks, she said carefully, I want to be clear about something. What happened today, the interview outcome, wasn't personal. Wasn't it? Ethan asked quietly. It was based on the position requirements as they were written, Patricia continued. Requirements that, as Ms. Donovan pointed out, may need to be revisited. But I want you to know that I wasn't trying to dismiss your value as an employee. You were dismissing my value as a candidate, Ethan said. I'm not sure what the meaningful difference is. Patricia was silent for a moment. Then, you're right, there isn't one. I applied standards without questioning whether those standards actually measured what mattered. That was a mistake. It was, Ethan thought, a remarkably honest admission from someone who'd just been publicly corrected by her CEO. I appreciate that, he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. The Executive Services program is rigorous, Patricia said, shifting back to professional territory. You'll be evaluated constantly. There will be people who question whether you belong there. Some of them will be your peers. Some of them will be your supervisors. I'm used to people questioning whether I belong places, Ethan said. I'm sure, Patricia replied. But this will be different. These won't be people who dismiss you without knowing you. These will be people who know you and dismiss you anyway. People who think Ms. Donovan is making a mistake. People who are invested in seeing you fail because it validates their belief system about who deserves opportunities. Why are you telling me this? Ethan asked. Because I don't want you to be surprised when it happens, Patricia said bluntly. And because despite how today started, I actually do believe in being honest with people about what they're walking into. You're walking into a fight, Mr. Brooks. Ms. Donovan opened the door, but you're going to have to defend your right to walk through it every single day. Ethan gathered his papers, his new ID badge, his folder full of policies and procedures. I've been fighting for 6 years, he said. I'm just fighting for something now. He left Donovan Industries through the front door, as Claire had instructed. The evening air was cool, the sun starting its descent toward the horizon. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the building that had been his workplace for 6 years, seeing it from a new angle. His phone buzzed, a text from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who watched Marcus after school. Marcus wants to know if you got the job. Ethan looked at the message for a long moment, thinking about how to answer. Then he typed, Tell him Dad got a better job. I'll explain when I get home. The response came quickly. He's jumping on the couch. I'm pretending not to notice. Ethan smiled, a real smile that felt like it came from somewhere deep and untouched by years of disappointment. He started walking toward the subway, toward home, toward his son, who would be waiting with questions and excitement and the absolute faith that children have in their parents before the world teaches them to doubt. Monday morning, he would walk through the front door of Donovan Industries as something other than invisible. He would prove that Claire Donovan's faith wasn't misplaced. He would earn every opportunity given to him, not because he was grateful to have been rescued, but because he'd never needed rescuing, only recognition. For tonight, though, he just needed to get home, to hold his son and let himself believe, for the first time in years, that the door hadn't closed after all. It had been pushed wide open. Now he just had to be brave enough to walk through it. The subway ride home felt different than it had that morning. The same rattling cars, the same flickering lights, the same press of bodies tired from their own long days. But Ethan carried something new in his chest, not quite hope, because hope was a dangerous thing when you'd learned to survive without it, but something adjacent to it. Possibility, maybe. The sense that the future might contain more than just variations of struggle. Marcus was indeed jumping on the couch when Ethan walked into their small apartment. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her expression somewhere between exasperated and amused, clearly having given up on enforcing furniture rules in favor of letting the boy celebrate. "Dad!" Marcus launched himself off the couch with the fearless trajectory of children who haven't yet learned that bodies can betray you. Ethan caught him automatically, swinging him up despite the weight that seemed to increase every week, despite the long day pressing down on his shoulders. "Hey, buddy," Ethan said, holding his son close and breathing in the scent of school and playground and the strawberry shampoo Mrs. Chen insisted on using. "I hear you've been using the furniture as a trampoline." "Mrs. Chen said you got a better job," Marcus said, pulling back to look at his father with eyes that were so much like his mother's that it sometimes hurt to meet them directly. "What does better mean? Is it more money? Can we get a dog?" Ethan laughed, the sound surprising him with its ease. "Maybe eventually. The better part means I'll be working during the day now. Regular hours. I'll be home at night." Marcus's face transformed with understanding. At 7, he was still young enough to prioritize his father's presence over almost anything else, but old enough to have noticed the absence. "Every night?" "Most nights," Ethan amended, because he'd learned not to make promises he couldn't guarantee. "And I'll have weekends sometimes. We could actually go to the park on Saturday mornings like other families." "Can we go this Saturday?" Marcus asked immediately. "Not this Saturday," Ethan said gently. "I start the new job on Monday and I need to prepare. But soon, I promise." Mrs. Chen cleared her throat diplomatically. "I'll leave you two to celebrate. Marcus had his dinner already, chicken and rice. There's extra in the kitchen if you're hungry." "Thank you," Ethan said, meaning it for so much more than just the meal. Mrs. Chen had been watching Marcus after school for 3 years now, charging rates that were far below market value because, as she'd said once, "You're a good father trying hard. That deserves support." He made a mental note to give her a proper bonus once his first paycheck from the new position came through. After she left, Marcus dragged Ethan to the couch. The same couch he'd been jumping on, now pressed into service as a conference location. "Tell me everything," Marcus demanded with the imperial authority of a 7-year-old who'd been waiting hours for information. So Ethan told him. Not the whole truth. Marcus didn't need to know about the humiliation of the interview, the particular flavor of being dismissed for not fitting someone's image. But he told him about Claire Donovan, about the training program, about the chance to prove himself. "She's the boss of the whole building?" Marcus asked, eyes wide. "The boss of the whole company," Ethan corrected. "Thousands of employees. And she remembered that I helped someone once, and she decided that mattered." "You help people all the time," Marcus said, as if this were obvious fact. "You help Mr. Peterson fix his door, and you help Mrs. Chen carry her groceries when her back hurt, and you help me with my breathing when it gets bad." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "That's different, buddy. That's just being a decent person." "Maybe she thinks being a decent person matters," Marcus said with the simple logic that children apply to complex situations, accidentally cutting straight to the truth. That night, after Marcus fell asleep clutching the inhaler that never left his bedside, Ethan sat at their small kitchen table with his laptop and the folder of paperwork from Patricia. The Executive Services Training Program, according to the documentation, was a 6-month intensive designed to prepare high-potential employees for management track positions. High potential. The phrase felt foreign applied to himself. The schedule was demanding, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, with occasional evening or weekend sessions. The curriculum covered everything from corporate communication protocols to financial analysis to crisis management. Participants would rotate through different departments, learning the operations from the inside while being evaluated constantly. There was a section titled Program Expectations that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Professional presentation at all times, effective written and verbal communication, ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, demonstration of leadership potential, and strategic thinking. And there, at the bottom, in smaller text, please note that this program is highly competitive. Participants who do not meet performance standards may be transitioned back to their original positions. Patricia's warning echoed in his mind. You're walking into a fight. Ethan opened his email and found the message Patricia had sent with joining instructions. Report to conference room 14B on Monday at 8 a.m. Business professional attire required. Bring a notepad and pen for orientation. Business professional attire. Ethan looked down at the suit he'd worn to the interview, his only suit, purchased at a discount store 3 years ago for a funeral. It was clean and pressed but unmistakably cheap, the kind of garment that announced its price point in every line. He'd need at least 2 more, probably 3 to rotate through the week. Shirts, ties, shoes that weren't obviously resold. He opened his banking app and looked at the balance that was always precarious, always balanced on the edge of insufficient. The medical bills from Marcus's last hospital visit were still being paid off in installments. Rent was due in 2 weeks. There were groceries to buy, utilities to keep on, the 1,000 small costs of keeping a child alive and housed and healthy. New clothes would have to wait. He'd make the one suit work somehow, wash shirts in the sink at night, hope nobody noticed or cared that he was wearing the same rotation constantly. Ethan spent Saturday morning researching. He looked up the other people in the program. Their names were listed in the welcome packet. 6 participants total. He found them on LinkedIn, on company directories, in business journal mentions. Jessica Hartwell, MBA from Northwestern. Previous experience in strategic consulting. Father was a VP at a competing firm. David Chen, no relation to the David Chen he'd helped. Dual degree from Penn in business and engineering. Had interned at Donovan Industries during college, knew the systems already. Rachel Morrison, former military officer with a degree from Georgetown. Decorated service record. Looked like someone who'd never questioned whether she belonged anywhere. Thomas Wright, Harvard undergrad and Stanford MBA. Current role in business development. His LinkedIn photo showed him at a charity gala with Claire Donovan. Allison Park, Yale Law, previously worked in corporate strategy at 2 Fortune 500 companies before joining Donovan Industries. And Ethan Brooks, high school diploma, military service, 6 years as a janitor. He closed the laptop, feeling the familiar weight of inadequacy settling over him. These weren't just people with advantages. These were people whose entire lives had been structured around preparation for exactly this kind of opportunity. They spoke the language of corporate culture fluently. They knew which fork to use at business dinners, which tie was appropriate for which meeting, how to small talk with executives without seeming either obsequious or overfamiliar. Ethan knew how to strip a floor and make it shine, knew the exact mixture of chemicals that would remove any stain, knew how to be invisible even when standing right in front of someone. Sunday evening, Marcus asked the question that Ethan had been dreading. "Dad, are you scared?" They were sitting together on the couch, Marcus tucked under his father's arm, some animated movie playing on the television that neither of them were really watching. Ethan could have lied, could have provided the reassurance that children needed from their parents. But he'd promised himself after Sarah died that he wouldn't lie to their son, not about the things that mattered. "Yeah, buddy," Ethan said quietly. "I'm scared." "Why?" Marcus tilted his head up to look at him. "You're really smart. You know everything." "I know some things," Ethan corrected gently, "but the people I'll be working with know different things. Things they learned in college. Things I'll have to figure out as I go. But you're good at figuring things out, Marcus said with absolute confidence. You figured out how to fix my toy truck, and you figured out how to make Mrs. Chen's sink stop leaking, and you figured out the medicine that helps my breathing. That's different from knowing how to do business things, Ethan tried to explain. Why? Marcus asked with the persistent logic of children who haven't yet learned that some questions don't have good answers. Figuring things out is figuring things out. Ethan didn't have a response to that. He held his son closer and wondered if faith was something that could be borrowed, if Marcus's certainty could somehow become his own. Monday morning arrived with mechanical inevitability. Ethan woke at 5:30 out of habit, his body still programmed for night shifts, even though those were behind him now. He showered carefully, shaved twice to make sure there was no shadow of stubble, dressed in his one suit with meticulous attention to every detail. The tie took 3 attempts to get the knot right and symmetrical. Marcus shuffled into the bathroom while Ethan was combing his hair, still wearing his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You look fancy," he mumbled. "I look nervous," Ethan corrected, but smiled at his son in the mirror. "You look like a dad going to an important job," Marcus said. "That's fancy." Mrs. Chen arrived at 7 to get Marcus ready for school. She looked Ethan up and down appraisingly. "Very professional," she said with a nod of approval. "You'll do fine." "How do you know?" Ethan asked. "Because you've been doing fine for years," Mrs. Chen said simply. "This is just people finally noticing." The subway was crowded with the morning rush, bodies pressed together in that particular intimacy of strangers forced into proximity. Ethan stood holding the rail, watching the stations pass, and thought about how many times he'd made this same journey in reverse, heading home as everyone else headed to work. He emerged from the subway 3 blocks from Donovan Industries at 7:40. Early, but not so early as to seem desperate. He walked slowly, using the time to settle his breathing, to press down the anxiety that wanted to manifest as visible nervousness. The building looked different in morning light, more imposing, somehow. The glass and steel gleaming with aggressive modernity, the logo above the entrance radiating corporate success. Ethan paused at the base of the steps, looking up at the structure he'd entered thousands of times through service entrances and loading docks. "Come through the front door," Claire had said. "You work here. Act like it." Ethan climbed the steps with measured confidence he didn't feel, pulled open the heavy glass door, and walked into the lobby during business hours for the first time in 6 years. The front desk was staffed by someone he didn't recognize, the position he'd interviewed for, now filled by a young man with styled hair and an expensive watch. The lobby was busy with people arriving, coffee in hand, ready to begin their productive days making money for the company that paid them to be visible. Nobody looked at him. Nobody recognized the night janitor now dressed in a cheap suit. He was, for the moment, just another employee. Just another person who belonged here. Ethan took the elevator to the 14th floor, found conference room 14B, and arrived at exactly 7:55. The door was open. Inside, 3 people were already seated around the table. 2 women and a man, all professionally dressed, all holding notebooks and expensive pens, all exuding the casual confidence of people who'd been preparing for this moment their entire lives. They looked up when Ethan entered, their expressions polite and assessing. Ethan recognized them from his research. Jessica Hartwell, the consulting background. Rachel Morrison, the military officer. Thomas Wright, the Harvard MBA. "Good morning," Ethan said, keeping his voice level and professional. "I'm Ethan Brooks." "Thomas Wright," the man said, standing to shake hands. His grip was firm, his smile friendly. "Good to meet you. This is Jessica and Rachel." They exchanged greetings with the careful politeness of people who would be competing while pretending to collaborate. Ethan took a seat across from them, pulled out the notebook and pen he'd purchased at the drugstore, nothing fancy, but functional, and waited. David Chen and Allison Park arrived within the next few minutes. More introductions, more handshakes, more polite smiles that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. They were all evaluating each other, Ethan realized, trying to assess the competition, to identify weaknesses, to calculate their own standing in this new hierarchy. At exactly 8 a.m., the door opened and a woman entered, older, perhaps 60, with silver hair cut in a precise bob and an air of someone who suffered no nonsense whatsoever. "Good morning," she said crisply. "I'm Margaret Foster, Director of Executive Development. I'll be overseeing this program." She took a position at the head of the table, not sitting but standing with her hands folded, looking at each of them in turn. When her eyes reached Ethan, they lingered for just a moment longer than on the others. He couldn't read her expression. "The 6 of you have been selected for this program from a pool of exceptional candidates," Margaret began. You're here because you've demonstrated potential. Potential, however, is not achievement. Over the next 6 months, you'll be expected to prove that the company's investment in you is justified. Many people are watching. Some of them hope you'll succeed. Some of them expect you'll fail. Neither matters as much as what you actually accomplish. She paused, letting that sink in. This program has a 67% completion rate. 1 in 3 participants are transitioned back to their previous positions before the 6 months conclude. This isn't because they're incompetent. It's because they're not yet ready for what we're preparing them for. If that happens to you, it's not the end of your career here, but it is a setback. Are there any questions before we begin? Ethan had 1,000 questions, but none he could articulate in front of these strangers who were already so far ahead. "Excellent," Margaret said into the silence. "Let's start with introductions. Tell us your name, your current role, and one thing you hope to gain from this program. Ms. Hartwell, if you'd begin?" Jessica Hartwell sat up straighter, her posture perfect. "I'm Jessica Hartwell, currently in strategic operations. I have an MBA from Northwestern and 3 years of consulting experience prior to joining Donovan. I'm hoping to develop my understanding of how strategy translates into execution across different departments." Polished, professional. The answer of someone who'd been media trained or had simply absorbed how to speak in corporate environments. Rachel Morrison went next. Rachel Morrison, currently in security operations. Former Army officer, served 2 tours overseas. "I'm here to translate my leadership experience into the corporate environment and understand how to scale operational discipline." Strong, direct, the kind of person who knew how to command and expected to be heard. They went around the table. David Chen talking about integrating his technical background with business acumen. Allison Park discussing her transition from law to strategy. Thomas Wright mentioning his family's history with the company and wanting to prove himself on his own merit. And then it was Ethan's turn. 6 pairs of eyes turned to him. Margaret Foster's expression remained neutral, but he sensed something evaluative in her attention. "I'm Ethan Brooks," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I've been with Donovan Industries for 6 years in facilities maintenance, night shift operations. I'm here because I want to demonstrate that competence isn't limited to people with traditional backgrounds, and because I have a son who deserves to see his father work during the day." The silence that followed was heavy with surprise. He watched their faces process the information. Facilities maintenance, night shift. The translation didn't require explanation. They all knew what he was really saying. "I'm the janitor. I'm the person you wouldn't have noticed. I'm the one who doesn't belong here." Jessica's expression flickered with something that might have been pity or discomfort. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, reassessing. Thomas's smile remained fixed but had gone artificial. Margaret Foster's face showed nothing. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks," she said evenly, as if he'd revealed nothing more surprising than anyone else. "The honesty is noted and appreciated." She moved on without dwelling on it, launching into an overview of the program structure. Ethan tried to focus on her words, something about rotational assignments, performance metrics, executive mentorship. But part of his attention was caught by the subtle shift in the room's dynamics. He'd marked himself as different, as other, as the person who needed to prove himself more than anyone else. The morning session covered program logistics and expectations. Margaret distributed thick binders containing schedules, reading materials, company policies, and departmental overviews. She explained that they'd spend the first 2 weeks in intensive orientation, learning everything from corporate communication protocols to financial analysis basics. Then they'd begin their rotational assignments, 2 months in each department with weekly evaluations. "You'll also be assigned executive mentors," Margaret said. "These are senior leaders who volunteered to provide guidance. Your mentor assignments will be given out next week. Use them wisely. They're busy people donating their time because they believe in developing talent." After Margaret left for lunch break, the 6 of them remained in the conference room with boxed meals that had been delivered. For several minutes, no one spoke. Everyone focused on their food with the intensity of people avoiding conversation. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. So, Ethan, that's quite a jump from night shift maintenance to executive services. How'd you manage to get into the program? The question was casual, but Ethan heard the subtext. How did you, of all people, end up here with us? I applied for a front desk position, Ethan said evenly. The interview didn't go well. The CEO happened to witness it and made a different offer. Claire Donovan personally recruited you? Jessica asked, her surprise evident. Claire Donovan personally corrected a hiring decision she felt was based on the wrong criteria, Ethan replied. Then she offered me a chance to prove I could handle more than answering phones. That's unusual, Allison said carefully. Ms. Donovan doesn't typically intervene in hiring decisions at that level. I gathered that, Ethan said. Do you know why she did? Rachel asked, her military directness cutting through the careful corporate language everyone else was using. Because I helped someone once, Ethan said, and because she believes in recognizing competence over credentials. Must be nice, Thomas said, and there was an edge to his voice now, the friendly surface cracking slightly. Having the CEO as a personal advocate. I don't have the CEO as an advocate, Ethan said, meeting his eyes directly. I have the CEO's attention, which means I'll be watched more closely than any of you. If I fail, it doesn't just reflect on me, it reflects on her judgment. That's not an advantage, that's additional pressure. The truth of that settled over the conversation. Whatever assumptions they'd been making were being recalculated. Well, David said into the resulting silence, I guess we're all here for our own reasons. Might as well try to help each other succeed, right? It was a diplomatic offering, a suggestion that they could be collaborative rather than competitive. Several people nodded, but Ethan noticed that Thomas's expression remained skeptical, that Jessica was watching him with careful assessment, that even Rachel's friendly demeanor had gained a layer of professional distance. They weren't enemies, but they weren't allies either. They were competitors pretending at cooperation, all of them aware that only some of them would make it through successfully. The afternoon session was led by someone from corporate communications, teaching them the basics of business writing and presentation. Ethan took notes carefully, paying attention to things that others seemed to already know. How to structure an executive email, what information to put in the subject line, how to format a proposal. He'd sent plenty of emails over the years, but they'd been simple things. Maintenance requests, incident reports, nothing that required this level of polish and protocol. When the session ended at 6 p.m., Ethan's hand was cramped from writing and his head was full of information that hadn't yet organized itself into useful knowledge. The others gathered their materials with practiced efficiency, making plans to grab drinks or dinner, continuing their networking. Ethan, you joining us? David asked, friendly enough. Can't, Ethan said. I need to get home to my son. Right, you mentioned him, David said. How old? 7, Ethan replied, already packing his bag. I've been working nights for most of his life. Being home in the evenings is still new for both of us. Must be an adjustment, David said, and seemed genuinely sympathetic. Well, another time maybe. Ethan left them in the lobby, stepped out into the evening air, and felt the day crash over him like a wave. He'd survived. First day completed, no catastrophic failures, but he'd also felt with absolute clarity the enormous gap between himself and the others. They moved through this world naturally, speaking its language fluently, understanding its unwritten rules. He was translating everything, running every interaction through a filter of, is this right? Is this how it's done? Am I revealing my inadequacy? The subway ride home was crowded with the evening rush. Ethan stood pressed between strangers, holding his bag against his chest, and wondered how many days like this he could endure. How many times he could walk into a room and feel immediately that he didn't belong. How many subtle reminders that he was the charity case, the unusual choice, the one everyone was watching to see if he'd prove their skepticism right. Marcus was waiting at the door when Ethan arrived, practically vibrating with curiosity. How was it? Did you do important things? Did you meet the boss lady again? It was long, Ethan said, dropping his bag and pulling his son into a hug. And yes, I did important things. I learned a lot. Was it good learning or hard learning? Marcus asked, because at 7 he already understood that those weren't always the same thing. Both, Ethan admitted, good and hard at the same time. Like when I learned to ride my bike, Marcus said sagely. It was hard, but then it got good. Exactly like that, Ethan agreed, hoping it was true. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the binder Margaret had given them. He started reading through the materials, making notes, trying to absorb information that would help him not just survive, but actually succeed. There was a section on corporate structure, explaining the hierarchy of roles and responsibilities. A section on financial literacy, covering basics that apparently everyone was expected to understand. A section on professional development, outlining the skills that marked someone as ready for advancement. And there, buried in the middle, was a section on networking. Building professional relationships, the header read. Effective networking is essential for career advancement. Successful executives understand how to develop and maintain connections across departments and levels. Ethan thought about the others making plans for drinks, continuing their relationships outside of program hours. Thought about Thomas with his family connections, Jessica with her consulting background, all of them moving in circles he'd never been part of and didn't know how to enter. He closed the binder and stared at the wall of their small kitchen, at the calendar where he'd marked Marcus's doctor's appointments and school events, at the photograph of Sarah that he kept meaning to move somewhere less visible but never could. I don't know if I can do this, he said quietly to the empty room, to his late wife's photograph, to the universe that seemed determined to test him. But Marcus was asleep down the hall, breathing steadily with the help of medication that Ethan could finally afford. And somewhere across the city, Claire Donovan had put her reputation on the line, believing he was capable of more than invisibility. So he opened the binder again, returned to the section on financial literacy, and began reading, because the alternative was giving up. And giving up meant proving right everyone who'd ever dismissed him. And Ethan Brooks had walked away from that interview with his dignity intact. He'd be damned if he'd lose it now just because the challenge had grown harder. The reading stretched past midnight, and when Ethan finally closed his laptop, his eyes burned with exhaustion, and his brain felt overstuffed with information that hadn't yet settled into understanding. But he'd made it through the financial literacy section, had taken notes on terms like EBITDA and capital expenditure and return on investment, had tried to connect abstract concepts to the concrete reality of keeping a building functional and a child healthy. The second day began with a presentation skills workshop. Margaret brought in someone from an outside consulting firm, a woman named Dr. Ellen Marsh, who specialized in executive communication. She was sharp and efficient, wasting no time on pleasantries before diving into the fundamentals of presenting to senior leadership. You have 30 seconds to establish credibility, Dr. Marsh said, clicking through slides that demonstrated the difference between effective and ineffective openings. Most of you will get less. The executives you'll be presenting to are busy, distracted, and already forming opinions before you speak your first word. Your job is to make them believe you're worth listening to. She pulled up a video of a presentation, paused it at the opening. Watch the body language. Notice the confident stance, the direct eye contact, the deliberate pace of speech. These aren't accidents. They're choices that signal competence. Ethan watched the video, seeing details he'd never consciously noticed before. The way the presenter's hands moved with purpose rather than nervousness. The pauses that created emphasis. The subtle shift in tone that indicated moving between topics. It was like learning that conversation had grammar, that communication followed rules he'd been breaking without knowing they existed. Now, Dr. Marsh said, each of you will give a 2-minute presentation introducing yourself and your professional goals. Consider this practice for the real presentations you'll be giving throughout this program. The familiar anxiety tightened Ethan's chest. Public speaking was different from the kind of communication he'd been doing for years. Instructions to his night crew were straightforward, functional. This required performance, required making yourself compelling. Jessica went first, delivering a polished introduction that touched on her consulting background, her strategic thinking, her commitment to driving value. It sounded rehearsed, but in a good way, like she'd practiced until the performance became natural. Rachel was more direct, her military bearing evident in every word. She spoke about leadership under pressure, about building teams that functioned in crisis, about translating operational excellence into business outcomes. It was impressive in its clarity and confidence. Thomas talked about his passion for the company, about wanting to honor his family's legacy by bringing fresh perspectives, about understanding both the historical foundation and the innovative future. It was carefully constructed to acknowledge his advantages while suggesting he wasn't relying on them. David discussed bridging technical expertise with business strategy, about seeing problems from multiple angles, about the value of diverse perspectives in solution development. Allison spoke about the intersection of legal thinking and strategic planning, about risk management not as prevention, but as calculated decision-making. And then it was Ethan's turn. He stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of 5 pairs of eyes evaluating him, Dr. Marsh's assessment most intense of all. He'd prepared something the night before, had practiced it quietly in his head while Marcus ate breakfast, but now the words felt inadequate. "I'm Ethan Brooks," he began, keeping his voice steady. "For 6 years, I've worked in facilities maintenance at Donovan Industries. That work taught me things I didn't realize I was learning. Crisis management when a pipe burst at 3 a.m. and I had to protect sensitive equipment while coordinating emergency repairs. Operations oversight when I trained new crew members on safety protocols and efficiency standards. Attention to detail because in my role, the things you miss become problems for everyone else." He paused, meeting each person's eyes briefly. "I'm here because I want to prove that competence isn't defined by where you started, but by what you do with the opportunities you're given. My professional goal is to demonstrate that the skills I developed in an unconventional path have value in conventional spaces. And my personal goal is to build a career that allows me to provide stability for my son while showing him that determination matters more than circumstance." The silence when he finished felt different than after the others. Less polished, perhaps. More raw. He couldn't tell if that was good or bad. Dr. Marsh studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Brooks, that was honest to the point of vulnerability. In some contexts, that's powerful. In others, it's dangerous. You're asking your audience to look past their preconceptions, which means you're acknowledging those preconceptions exist. That's a risk. Not acknowledging them doesn't make them disappear," Ethan said quietly. "True," Dr. Marsh agreed, "but there's a difference between addressing barriers and centering your identity around them. You're capable. Lead with that. The backstory is context, not justification." The criticism stung because it was accurate. He'd been so conscious of being different that he'd made his difference the main point instead of letting his competence speak first. "Noted," Ethan said, returning to his seat with the uncomfortable awareness that he'd just revealed exactly how insecure he felt. During the lunch break, Ethan stayed in the conference room while the others went to the cafeteria together. He told himself it was because he wanted to review his notes, but the truth was simpler and more pathetic. He didn't want to navigate the social dynamics of lunch conversation, didn't want to field questions about his background, didn't want to feel like the charity case breaking bread with the qualified candidates. He was halfway through his sandwich when Margaret Foster appeared in the doorway. "Not joining the others?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Wanted to catch up on reading," Ethan said, gesturing to the open binder on the table. Margaret entered the room, closing the door behind her. "May I speak frankly, Mr. Brooks?" "Please," Ethan said, setting down his sandwich and preparing for whatever criticism was coming. "I've been running this program for 8 years, Margaret said, taking a seat across from him. "I've seen a lot of participants. The ones who fail aren't usually the ones who lack skills. They're the ones who defeat themselves before anyone else has the chance to." "I'm not trying to defeat myself," Ethan said carefully. "Aren't you?" Margaret tilted her head slightly. "You're isolating from your cohort. You're framing yourself as the outsider in every introduction. You're treating your background as an obstacle to overcome rather than a perspective to leverage." "It is an obstacle," Ethan said, frustration leaking into his voice. "I don't have their education. I don't speak their language fluently. I spent 6 years being invisible while they were building resumes and networks. Those aren't perceptions. They're facts." "They're facts you're choosing to prioritize over other facts," Margaret countered. "Here's another fact. Claire Donovan hand-selected you for this program despite hundreds of other candidates. She didn't do that because she felt sorry for you. She did it because she saw something she considered valuable. Your job is to prove her judgment was sound, not to prove that you deserve pity for having a harder path. The words landed with the force of truth that hurt. Ethan sat with them for a moment, feeling his defensive anger slowly transform into something more useful. "How do I do that?" he asked finally. "How do I stop seeing myself as the one who doesn't belong?" "By recognizing that none of them fully belong yet either," Margaret said. "This program exists because even the most qualified candidates need development. Jessica's consulting background doesn't automatically translate to corporate strategy. Rachel's military leadership doesn't automatically adapt to business environments. They're all learning. The difference is that they're not questioning their right to be here while they do it." She stood, preparing to leave. "You have skills they don't, Mr. Brooks. You understand operations from the ground level. You've managed limited resources effectively. You've handled crises without the luxury of extensive support systems. Those are advantages if you frame them as such. Stop apologizing for being different and start using difference as strength." After she left, Ethan sat alone with her words, with his half-eaten sandwich, with the uncomfortable realization that his biggest obstacle wasn't his background. It was his own certainty that his background disqualified him. The afternoon brought their first group project, analyzing a case study about a company facing operational challenges and developing strategic recommendations. Margaret divided them into pairs, and through either deliberate choice or unfortunate randomness, Ethan was partnered with Thomas. They claimed a smaller conference room to work, spreading out the case materials on the table. The scenario involved a manufacturing company struggling with efficiency problems, supply chain disruptions, and employee morale issues. "Pretty straightforward," Thomas said, skimming through the documents. "Classic operational efficiency problem disguised as a strategic challenge. We recommend restructuring the supply chain, implementing lean manufacturing principles, maybe some workforce engagement initiatives." "Have you worked in manufacturing?" Ethan asked. "No, but I've studied cases like this," Thomas replied, already making notes. "The patterns are consistent across industries." Ethan read through the case more carefully, looking at the details. The manufacturing facility was older, the equipment outdated, the efficiency metrics showed declining performance, but the employee retention was actually quite high. The supply chain issues were concentrated in specific components, not systemic across all materials. "I think the problem might be different than it looks," Ethan said slowly. Thomas glanced up. "How do you mean?" "They're not describing operational incompetence," Ethan said, thinking out loud. "They're describing equipment that's failing and workers who know it but don't have the authority to address it. Look here." He pointed to a section of employee feedback. "The workers are reporting specific maintenance issues, but management is categorizing them as efficiency complaints." "So you think it's a maintenance problem?" Thomas sounded skeptical. "I think it's a listening problem," Ethan corrected. "The people doing the work know what's wrong, but the people making decisions aren't asking the right questions. They're looking at output metrics and assuming it's a worker performance issue when it's actually an equipment reliability issue." Thomas considered this, looking back at the case with new attention. "That's actually not a terrible angle, different from the standard lean manufacturing response. Standard responses work for standard problems," Ethan said, "but if you're not listening to the people closest to the work, you'll solve the wrong problem efficiently." They spent the next 2 hours developing their analysis, and Ethan felt something shift in their dynamic. Thomas still carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place, but he was listening now, actually considering perspectives that didn't come from business school case studies. When they presented their findings to Margaret and Dr. Marsh at the end of the day, Ethan let Thomas take the lead on the opening and the formal strategic recommendations. But when it came time to discuss the root cause analysis, Ethan spoke up clearly. "The core issue isn't operational inefficiency, it's organizational listening," he said. "The workers are reporting problems that management is misinterpreting as complaints. Our recommendation is that before implementing any operational changes, the company needs to conduct a structured listening process where frontline workers can identify specific equipment and process issues without those issues being filtered through management assumptions." Dr. Marsh raised an eyebrow. "That's a softer recommendation than most groups focus on. How do you measure the ROI of listening?" "By measuring what it costs when you don't listen," Ethan replied. If you implement expensive efficiency programs that don't address the actual problems, you've wasted resources and damaged trust. If you fix the equipment issues that workers have been reporting for months, you solve the efficiency problem and build credibility with your workforce simultaneously. Interesting perspective, Dr. Marsh said, making notes. Where does that analysis come from? Experience, Ethan said simply. I've spent years watching people make decisions about operations without consulting the people actually doing the work. Sometimes they get lucky, and the decision works. Usually they solve symptoms instead of causes. Margaret's expression was unreadable, but she nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Brooks, Mr. Wright. Well-considered work. As they left the conference room, Thomas paused in the hallway. That was good, he said, and sounded like he meant it. The listening angle. I wouldn't have thought of that. You would have eventually, Ethan said. You're smart enough. You just haven't had to think about what it's like when nobody listens to you. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's probably true, he admitted. Look, I want to apologize for yesterday. The comment about having the CEO as an advocate. That was unnecessary. But honest, Ethan said. Honest, but graceless, Thomas corrected. I saw your background and made assumptions. That was lazy thinking. We all make assumptions, Ethan said. I assumed you'd coast on your family connections and your degrees. Maybe we're both learning that people are more complicated than their resumes suggest. Thomas smiled, genuine this time. Maybe so. Want to grab a drink with everyone? They're meeting at a place near here. Ethan hesitated, the old instinct to isolate rising up. But Margaret's words echoed in his head. Stop apologizing for being different. I can't tonight, Ethan said. I need to get home to my son. But maybe another time. Friday? Thomas offered. End of our first week. That seems worth celebrating. Friday, Ethan agreed, and felt something small and significant shift in his relationship to this new world. The rest of the week followed a pattern that began to feel almost sustainable. Morning sessions on various business fundamentals, finance, strategy, operations, marketing, afternoon workshops on skills like negotiation, data analysis, project management, evening reading that stretched past midnight as Ethan tried to absorb information that others had learned over years of formal education. Marcus noticed his father's exhaustion, but seemed to interpret it as a positive sign. You're working hard, he said one evening, watching Ethan struggle to focus on a chapter about competitive analysis. Like when I work hard on my reading homework. Exactly like that, Ethan agreed, pulling his son close. We're both learning important things. Are you getting good grades? Marcus asked with the simple logic of a 7-year-old who understood school in concrete terms. I don't know yet, Ethan admitted, but I'm trying my best. That's what Mrs. Chen says is most important, Marcus said confidently. Trying your best. Ethan wished the adult world operated on Mrs. Chen's grading system. Friday afternoon brought their first formal evaluation. Margaret met with each participant individually to discuss progress and provide feedback. When Ethan's turn came, he sat across from her in her office with the careful posture of someone expecting criticism. You've had an interesting first week, Mr. Brooks, Margaret began, reviewing notes on her tablet. Your technical grasp of the material is adequate, which is impressive given your educational background. Your written communication needs work. You tend toward overly simplistic phrasing in contexts that require more sophisticated language. Your presentation skills are developing but still show signs of discomfort with being the center of attention. Ethan nodded, accepting each observation without argument. However, Margaret continued, you demonstrated something in that case study analysis that several of your peers haven't yet shown. You approached the problem from a perspective that considered the human element of business operations. Most people trained in traditional business programs learn to see problems through metrics and models. You saw it through people. That's valuable. Thank you, Ethan said, surprised by the warmth of the feedback. Don't thank me yet, Margaret said dryly. Next week you begin your first rotation. You'll be assigned to the Strategy and Operations Department. It's one of the most demanding rotations in the program. You'll be expected to contribute to real projects with real consequences. Your background in facilities operations may or may not be relevant depending on what projects you're assigned. This is where we separate people who can learn from people who can apply learning. She pulled up a document on her screen, turned it so Ethan could see. This is your performance framework. You'll be evaluated on 6 criteria: analytical thinking, communication effectiveness, collaboration, initiative, professional presence, and strategic insight. Each criterion is measured on a scale from developing to exceptional. Your goal is to achieve proficient or above in at least 4 categories by the end of the rotation. Ethan scanned the framework, seeing the descriptions under each category. The language was dense, full of corporate terminology that he was still learning to parse. I've also assigned you a mentor, Margaret said. James Chen, no relation to David Chen, is our VP of Operations. He's been with the company for 15 years, started in logistics and worked his way up. I thought his career path might provide useful perspective for yours. When do I meet him? Ethan asked. Monday morning. You'll shadow him for a day to understand how the department functions. Then you'll be integrated into one of the project teams. He'll meet with you weekly to discuss your development. Margaret closed her tablet, looking at him directly. Mr. Brooks, I'm going to tell you something I don't usually share with participants. When Ms. Donovan told me she was adding you to this program, I objected. Not because I doubted your potential, but because I worried that the gap between your starting point and your peers would make success nearly impossible. I thought we'd be setting you up for public failure. Ethan felt his stomach tighten, but kept his expression neutral. I'm telling you this, Margaret continued, because I was wrong. Your work this week has demonstrated that competence develops through multiple pathways. You're not behind your peers. You're beside them with different strengths and different gaps. That's valuable if you stop treating it as a disadvantage. I'm working on that, Ethan said quietly. Work faster, Margaret replied, not unkindly. Self-doubt is expensive. It costs energy you need for actual development. I can teach you business strategy. I can improve your communication skills, but I can't make you believe you belong here. That's internal work only you can do. That evening, Ethan did meet the others for drinks. The bar was nice, but not aggressively upscale. The kind of place where young professionals gathered to decompress and network. Ethan felt conspicuously out of place in his work clothes, the same suit he'd been rotating all week, among people who'd clearly gone home to change into more casual, expensive clothing. But Thomas saw him arrive and waved him over to where the group had claimed a corner booth. Brooks, glad you made it. What are you drinking? Just a beer, Ethan said, sliding into the booth next to David. Whatever's on tap. Celebrating survival, Rachel said, raising her glass. Week 1 complete. Only 23 more to go. Don't remind me, Jessica groaned. I had 3 hours of reading last night on financial modeling. I have a business degree, and I still felt lost. The technical content isn't as hard as the performance anxiety, Allison said, knowing that every interaction is being evaluated, that every comment in a meeting might be noted in someone's assessment. It's like being under surveillance, David agreed. Professional surveillance, where the watchers are always friendly, but never forget anything. Ethan listened to them commiserate, hearing the shared stress underneath their different experiences. They were struggling too, just with different obstacles. Jessica worried about being seen as too theoretical, not practical enough. Rachel was concerned about translating military directness into corporate diplomacy. Allison felt pressure from her legal background to focus on risk rather than innovation. What about you, Ethan? Thomas asked. What's been hardest for you? The old instinct was to deflect, to minimize, to not burden them with his specific challenges, but Margaret's words echoed in his mind. Stop apologizing for being different. Believing I have a right to be there, Ethan said honestly. You all have these backgrounds that prepared you for this. I'm learning the language while trying to speak it fluently. It's like you're all playing instruments you've practiced for years, and I'm learning to read music while performing. The analogy landed in silence. Then Rachel spoke up, her military bluntness cutting through any potential awkwardness. You know what's interesting about that? She said. We've all been trained in the same instruments. We all play the same songs the same ways. You might be learning music, but you're also hearing things we're deaf to because we've been taught there's only one right way to play. The case study, David said, understanding. Thomas told us about your listening analysis. That wasn't a traditional business approach. Because I'm not a traditional business student, Ethan said. Exactly. Rachel replied. And maybe that's not the disadvantage you think it is. The military taught me to value chain of command and operational discipline. That's useful. But it also made me tone deaf to when rules need questioning. You don't have that conditioning. You're questioning everything because you don't know what's supposed to be unquestioned. That sounds exhausting, Jessica said sympathetically. It is, Ethan admitted, but maybe less exhausting than pretending I know things I don't. God, I wish I could do that, Allison said, surprising everyone. Do you know how much energy I waste pretending I understand references to business school frameworks I never studied? How often I nod along like I know what someone means by Porter's 5 forces or blue ocean strategy, then go home and frantically Google it? You don't know Porter's 5 forces? Thomas asked, shocked. You have a law degree. From Yale Law, not Yale Business School, Allison shot back. I know contracts and regulations and risk frameworks. I'm learning competitive strategy on the fly while pretending I've always known it. The conversation opened up after that, each of them admitting the ways they were faking confidence, the gaps in their knowledge they were desperate to hide, the pressure to perform expertise they hadn't fully developed. Ethan realized with sudden clarity that they were all imposters in different ways, all terrified of being revealed as insufficient. The difference was that they'd been trained to hide it better. So what do we do? David asked. We can't all admit we're struggling. That'll get us transitioned back to our original positions. We help each other, Rachel said decisively. We're competing against the program's standards, not against each other. If we all succeed, everyone wins. That's incredibly idealistic, Thomas said, but he was smiling. So was joining the military, Rachel replied. Sometimes idealism is just pragmatism with better marketing. They stayed at the bar until nearly 10, the conversation ranging from program stress to personal lives to shared complaints about Margaret's demanding standards. By the time Ethan left to catch his subway home, he felt something he hadn't experienced in the first week: connection. He texted Mrs. Chen on the way home, letting her know he was running late. Her response was understanding. Marcus is asleep, doors unlocked. See you tomorrow. When Ethan finally made it home, he checked on his son, sleeping peacefully, inhaler on the nightstand, stuffed dinosaur clutched against his chest. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of breathing that no longer wheezed as badly now that they had better medication. This is why, he thought. This is what I'm fighting for. In the kitchen, he found a note from Mrs. Chen next to a plate of food she'd left for him. Marcus said to tell you he's proud of you, so am I. Ethan sat down at the table with the food and the note and the weight of a week that had transformed him in ways he was still processing. The reading materials were stacked on the counter, waiting for his attention. The schedule for Monday's rotation was in his email, requiring review and preparation. But for just a moment, Ethan let himself feel something dangerous and powerful. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone grasping at straws, but the earned hope of someone who'd survived the first test and discovered he might actually be capable of more. He'd walked away from that interview with his dignity intact. He'd survived a week among people who should have been impossibly ahead of him. He'd found unexpected allies and begun to build something that might eventually become belonging. The fight wasn't over. It had barely begun. But Ethan Brooks was still standing, still learning, still pushing forward toward a future he was starting to believe might actually be possible. And that, he decided as he finally opened his laptop to review Monday's schedule, was victory enough for now. Monday morning arrived with the particular anxiety of new beginnings layered over fragile confidence. Ethan stood outside the Strategy and Operations Department at 7:45, 15 minutes early, because showing up exactly on time felt like cutting things too close. The department occupied the entire 16th floor, its glass doors etched with the company logo and a mission statement about driving excellence through integrated strategic planning. Through the glass, Ethan could see an open workspace dotted with private offices along the perimeter. People were already at their desks despite the early hour, focused on screens or talking in clusters around whiteboards covered in diagrams and metrics. This was where decisions about the company's direction were made, where strategy became operational reality, where the people who'd never noticed him mopping their floors at midnight determined which initiatives received resources and which were quietly shelved. The door opened and a man emerged, tall, probably mid-40s, wearing glasses and an expression of perpetual focus that suggested his mind was always 3 steps ahead of the current conversation. He extended his hand with efficient friendliness. "Ethan Brooks? I'm James Chen. Welcome to Strategy and Ops." His handshake was firm, his attention complete. Ethan recognized the deliberate presence of someone who'd learned that making people feel seen was as important as any strategic framework. "Thank you for taking the time to mentor me," Ethan said, following James through the glass doors into the department's organized chaos. "Margaret doesn't give me options," James replied with a slight smile. "But she usually has good instincts about matching people. She told me your background: former military, facilities operations, non-traditional path to the program. That's more interesting than most of the profiles I see." He led Ethan through the workspace, pointing out key features with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this tour dozens of times. "We're structured in cross-functional teams, each focused on different strategic initiatives. Team Alpha handles operational efficiency projects. Team Beta focuses on growth strategy and market expansion. Team Gamma works on organizational effectiveness and change management. You'll rotate through all 3 during your time here, spending about 3 weeks with each." They reached a corner office with James's name on the door. Inside was organized chaos, whiteboards covered in flowcharts, stacks of reports, multiple screens displaying different dashboards. James gestured for Ethan to sit. "Before we start, I want to understand what you're hoping to get from this rotation," James said, settling into his chair with the comfortable posture of someone who spent most of his life there. "What do you want to learn?" Ethan had prepared for this question during his weekend reading. "I want to understand how strategic decisions get made, how you evaluate competing priorities, how you translate high-level goals into actionable plans, how you measure whether initiatives are actually working." "Good answer," James said. "Broad enough to be genuine, specific enough to show you've thought about it. Now tell me what you're actually worried about." The directness caught Ethan off guard. He'd expected corporate diplomacy, not this kind of honest confrontation. "I'm worried I won't understand the analytical frameworks fast enough," Ethan admitted. "That I'll be asked to contribute to projects that require technical knowledge I don't have. That I'll slow down teams that are used to working with people who speak their language fluently." James nodded, unsurprised. "Those are legitimate concerns. Here's what I'm worried about: that you'll be so focused on what you don't know that you'll miss opportunities to contribute what you do know. Strategy isn't just analysis and frameworks. It's understanding how organizations actually function, how people respond to change, how theory meets reality. You have 6 years of watching this company function from a perspective most strategists never see. That's valuable if you use it." "How do I use it without seeming like I'm just talking about being a janitor?" Ethan asked, voicing the fear that had been haunting him. "By connecting your observations to strategic outcomes," James said simply. "Don't say, 'I used to clean the executive floor.' Say, 'I noticed that productivity in certain departments correlated with environmental factors that were being overlooked.' Don't talk about your past role. Talk about what your past role taught you that's relevant to current problems." He pulled up a document on one of his screens, turned it so Ethan could see. "This is a project Team Alpha is working on, improving operational efficiency in our manufacturing facilities. They've been analyzing data for 6 weeks and keep hitting walls. Their recommendations aren't landing with the facility managers. Want to know why? Because they're making recommendations without understanding the operational reality on the ground," Ethan guessed, thinking about the case study from the previous week. "Exactly," James said. "They're brilliant analysts. They can build models that predict efficiency gains down to the decimal point, but they've never set foot in a manufacturing facility. They don't understand the human factors, the practical constraints, the reason why theoretically optimal solutions don't work in practice." He closed the document, looked at Ethan directly. "That's where you come in. You're joining Team Alpha this week. Your job isn't to be the best analyst. You won't be. Your job is to be the person who asks whether the analysis reflects operational reality, to be the bridge between strategic theory and practical implementation." "That's a lot of pressure for someone who's never done strategic work," Ethan said. "Yes," James agreed, "but pressure is just weight applied to a surface. Whether it crushes you or forges you depends on what you're made of. Margaret thinks you're made of something durable. I'm inclined to trust her judgment, but you'll have to prove it. He stood, indicating the conversation was moving into action. Come on, let's introduce you to your team. Team Alpha occupied a section of the open workspace near the windows. 6 people clustered around desks arranged in a rough circle, their screens visible to each other in a setup that encouraged collaboration. James walked Ethan over with the casual confidence of someone whose presence commanded attention without requiring announcement. Team Alpha, this is Ethan Brooks from the Executive Services Program. He'll be rotating with you for the next 3 weeks. Ethan, this is Nina Rodriguez, team lead. He gestured to a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she was evaluating Ethan even as James spoke. Mark Sullivan, senior analyst. Priya Kapoor, operations specialist. Kevin Zhang, data analyst. Lisa Torres, project coordinator. And Daniel Foster, who's on his second rotation with us from finance. Handshakes and polite greetings followed, everyone performing the ritual of welcoming while simultaneously calculating how this new person would affect their workflow. Daniel, Ethan noticed, looked particularly young, probably fresh out of his MBA program, carrying himself with the uncertain confidence of someone still figuring out how to translate academic success into professional competence. Ethan will be shadowing the team this week, James continued. Nina, can you catch him up on the manufacturing efficiency project? Of course, Nina said, her voice professionally warm but with an undercurrent of assessment. Ethan, do you have time now? We're meeting with one of the facility managers this afternoon, and it would be useful for you to understand the context. I'm here to learn, Ethan said simply. James left them with a nod of encouragement, returning to his corner office and its strategic chaos. Nina led Ethan to one of the small conference rooms that dotted the perimeter of the department, Mark and Priya following with laptops and thick folders of materials. Okay, Nina said, pulling up a presentation on the conference room screen. Quick background, we have 12 manufacturing facilities across 8 states. Over the past 2 years, productivity has declined across all facilities, but particularly in the older ones. We were tasked with identifying root causes and developing recommendations to improve efficiency by 15% over the next year. The slides that followed were dense with data, productivity metrics, efficiency ratios, cost analyses, benchmark comparisons with industry standards. Ethan tried to follow the numbers, seeing patterns, but struggling to keep pace with the speed at which Nina moved through complex information. We've identified several key factors, Nina continued. Equipment age is negatively correlated with output. Facilities with older machinery show significantly lower efficiency. Labor costs have increased without corresponding productivity gains. Supply chain disruptions are creating idle time. What do the facility managers say? Ethan asked. Nina paused, looking slightly surprised by the interruption. The facility managers have been resistant to some of our preliminary findings. They claim the efficiency metrics don't reflect operational realities, that we're not accounting for factors that affect their specific situations. Are you? Ethan asked. Accounting for their specific situations? Mark spoke up, his tone carrying a hint of defensive frustration. We've analyzed 18 months of operational data across all 12 facilities. We're using standardized efficiency metrics recognized across the manufacturing industry. If the managers are claiming we're missing something, they need to provide data supporting their position. Have they tried to provide that data? Ethan asked. They've provided excuses, Mark said bluntly. Stories about equipment quirks and staffing challenges and local supply issues. Anecdotes, not data. Ethan thought about the case study, about Margaret's comment that he'd seen the problem through people rather than metrics. Can I ask a probably ignorant question? That's what you're here for, Nina said, and to her credit, she sounded like she meant it. Have any of you actually visited the facilities? Ethan asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. We've reviewed extensive documentation, Priya said carefully. Operational reports, maintenance logs, production schedules. We have video walkthroughs of each facility. We've conducted remote interviews with managers and supervisors. But you haven't been there, Ethan said. You haven't seen the equipment in person, talked to workers on the floor, watched the operations happen in real time. That's not typically how strategic analysis works, Mark said. And Ethan heard the implicit criticism. You don't understand how we do things here. I understand, Ethan said. I'm just wondering if maybe the reason your recommendations aren't landing is because you're solving the problem you see in the data instead of the problem they're experiencing on the ground. Nina exchanged a glance with Mark, some wordless communication passing between them. That's an interesting perspective, she said diplomatically. Unfortunately, we have budget and time constraints. Visiting 12 facilities isn't feasible at this stage of the project. What about one facility? Ethan suggested. Visit the one with the worst efficiency decline, spend a day there, see if what you observe matches what the data is telling you. We're meeting with the manager of the Cleveland facility this afternoon, Priya said thoughtfully. That's one of our biggest concern areas. We could ask him about a site visit. Couldn't hurt, Nina agreed, though she sounded uncertain. Worst case, we confirm our analysis is sound. Best case, we identify factors we've been missing. The meeting with the Cleveland facility manager happened over video conference at 2 p.m. Robert Martinez appeared on screen looking tired and frustrated, sitting in what was clearly a cluttered office in the middle of a working facility. Behind him, Ethan could hear the ambient noise of machinery, distant voices, the sound of a place where actual work happened. Nina led the meeting with professional courtesy, walking through their preliminary findings and proposed recommendations. Increase equipment maintenance efficiency through predictive analytics, implement lean manufacturing protocols, restructure shift schedules to optimize labor productivity, reduce supply chain disruption through improved forecasting. Robert listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard similar recommendations before and knew they wouldn't work. When Nina finished, he was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. These are good recommendations for a facility that's operating under ideal conditions, he said finally. But we're not operating under ideal conditions. Our equipment isn't just old, it's obsolete. Parts aren't available through normal supply channels. We've jerry-rigged solutions that keep things running, but it means we can't implement standard maintenance protocols. Your predictive analytics won't work because our machinery doesn't fail predictably. Have you submitted requests for equipment replacement? Mark asked, his tone suggesting this should have been obvious. Every year for the past 5 years, Robert said, his frustration breaking through professional composure. We're told it's not budget justified, that we need to improve efficiency with existing resources before new equipment will be approved, so we're stuck in this loop. We can't get new equipment until we're more efficient, but we can't be more efficient with equipment that's constantly breaking down. Ethan spoke up before he could second-guess himself. Mr. Martinez, this is Ethan Brooks. I'm new to the team. Can I ask, how much time does your staff spend on emergency repairs versus scheduled maintenance? Robert looked at him with interest, as if surprised someone was asking a question that suggested understanding of operational realities. Probably 60% emergency, 40% scheduled. We're constantly putting out fires, which means we can't do the preventive work that would reduce the fires. And your workers, Ethan continued, how long have most of them been with the facility? Average tenure is probably 15 years, Robert said. We have low turnover. People stay because we take care of each other, because we've built a culture where everyone looks out for the team. So you've experienced workers who know the equipment intimately, who've learned workarounds and solutions that keep obsolete machinery functional, Ethan said. That's actually remarkable operational competence under difficult constraints. Robert's expression shifted, some of the defensive frustration replaced with cautious hope that someone was finally understanding. That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. My workers are incredibly skilled, but we're being measured against facilities with modern equipment and told we're underperforming. After the meeting ended, Nina turned to Ethan with an expression that mixed surprise with reassessment. That was good questioning. You got him talking in ways we haven't been able to. I've been on his side of that conversation, Ethan said simply, trying to explain operational realities to people who are looking at data that doesn't capture what's actually happening. It helps to ask questions that acknowledge their expertise instead of questioning their performance. We need to visit that facility, Priya said decisively. I just volunteered us for a field trip to Cleveland. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan found his rhythm with Team Alpha. They did make the trip to Cleveland, spending 2 days at the facility observing operations, talking to workers, seeing firsthand the gap between strategic analysis and operational reality. What they found transformed their recommendations from theoretical optimization to practical support. The workers weren't inefficient. They were incredibly resourceful, keeping equipment running through ingenuity and institutional knowledge that no manual captured. The problem wasn't that they needed better processes. The problem was that they needed equipment that allowed standard processes to work. Ethan's contribution wasn't in the analytical modeling or the financial projections. His contribution was in translation, helping the team understand what they were seeing, asking questions that revealed information people had stopped sharing because they didn't think anyone was listening, connecting operational realities to strategic implications. "You're like an interpreter," Lisa told him one afternoon as they worked on revising their recommendations. "You take what we're saying in strategy language and translate it so it respects what the facilities are saying in operations language. Then you take what they're saying and translate it back so we understand the strategic implications." "I just remember what it was like to have expertise that nobody valued because it wasn't expressed in the right language," Ethan replied. By the end of his third week with Team Alpha, their revised recommendations had been accepted by both senior leadership and facility managers. The project shifted from optimizing efficiency with existing resources to justifying strategic investment in equipment modernization based on analysis that showed the long-term return. In his weekly meeting with James, Ethan sat in the corner office watching his mentor review performance notes with an expression that gave nothing away. "Nina says you're the reason they finally cracked the manufacturing project," James said without preamble. "She credits you with helping them see past their analytical blind spots." "I just asked questions," Ethan said, uncomfortable with praise that felt excessive. "Questions nobody else was asking," James corrected. "That's the definition of valuable contribution, seeing what others miss." "Your first rotation performance is solid, Ethan. You're rated proficient in collaboration and strategic insight, developing in analytical thinking and professional presence, emerging in communication effectiveness." "Is emerging in communication?" Ethan asked, surprised by the low rating. "You're good in small group settings and one-on-one conversations," James explained. "But you still hesitate in larger forums. You wait to be asked for input instead of offering it proactively. You're developing the skill of translation between operational and strategic perspectives, but you're not yet comfortable asserting that translation in high-stakes meetings." The criticism was accurate. Ethan had noticed his own tendency to hold back in larger group settings, to wait until someone asked directly before speaking up, to undervalue his own insights until they were validated by someone with more formal authority. "How do I fix that?" he asked. "By recognizing that your perspective has value independent of external validation," James said. "By understanding that offering insight isn't arrogance, it's contribution. By accepting that you've earned your place in the room and acting accordingly." That weekend, Ethan took Marcus to the park, as he'd promised weeks ago. They threw a football back and forth, Marcus's throws wild and enthusiastic, Ethan's careful and measured. The afternoon sun was warm, the grass green, the world temporarily uncomplicated by strategy frameworks and performance metrics. "Dad," Marcus said during a break, both of them sitting on a bench sharing a bottle of water, "are you happy with your new job?" The question surprised Ethan with its directness. "Why do you ask, buddy?" "Because you seem tired," Marcus said with the blunt observation of children who notice everything. "But also good tired? Like when I'm tired after playing really hard instead of tired from being sick." Ethan pulled his son close, marveling at his ability to distill complex emotional states into simple clarity. "That's exactly right. It's good tired. I'm working hard, learning a lot, doing things that matter." "And you're home at night," Marcus added. "That's the best part." "Yeah," Ethan agreed, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't expected. "That's definitely the best part." Monday brought a new challenge: rotation to Team Beta and the growth strategy portfolio. The team lead was a woman named Catherine Walsh, who had a reputation for brilliance and impatience in equal measure. She greeted Ethan with efficient courtesy that barely masked her assessment of whether he'd be useful or just another trainee to manage. "James says you're good at operational reality checks," Catherine said during their introduction meeting. "We'll see. Team Beta is working on evaluating potential acquisition targets. It's analytical work, financial modeling, market assessment. I'm not sure how much your facilities background applies, but I'm willing to be surprised." The work was different than Team Alpha, more abstract, more removed from tangible operations, more focused on numbers and projections than people and processes. Ethan struggled initially, the financial models beyond his immediate comprehension, the market analysis full of terminology he had to look up discreetly. But he found his footing by asking a question that apparently nobody had considered. How would we actually integrate an acquisition? Not financially, operationally. How would their processes mesh with ours? How would their culture fit? How would we retain their key people during transition? Catherine had looked at him with sharp interest. Those are integration planning questions. We don't usually address those until after acquisition. But don't they affect whether the acquisition makes strategic sense? Ethan asked. If the financial projections assume efficiency gains from integration, but integration would actually disrupt operations, then the projections are wrong. He's got a point, said Ryan, one of the senior analysts. We've been modeling this as a pure financial play without really thinking through the operational complications. What followed was 3 weeks of intensive learning as Ethan absorbed financial analysis while contributing operational perspective. He wasn't the strongest analytical mind on the team. That distinction belonged to Ryan and a woman named Sarah who could build complex financial models in her sleep. But he became the person who asked whether the numbers reflected realistic operational assumptions, who identified human factors that would affect strategic execution, who translated abstract strategy into concrete implementation challenges. Catherine's final assessment was direct and unsoftened by diplomatic cushioning. You're not a natural strategist, Brooks. You think tactically, operationally, but you're learning to connect tactical thinking to strategic outcomes. That's valuable. Keep developing it. The final rotation with Team Gamma, organizational effectiveness and change management, felt almost natural. The work focused on how companies adapted to change, how culture shaped performance, how leadership decisions rippled through organizations. It was, Ethan realized, what he'd been observing for 6 years from an invisible position. The team lead, Marcus Wilson, no relation to Ethan's son despite sharing a first name, was immediately interested in Ethan's perspective. You've been on the receiving end of organizational change decisions, Marcus said during their first meeting. You've seen how policies designed at the executive level actually affect frontline workers. That's the perspective we usually lack. Ethan thrived in this rotation, contributing insights about how change initiatives actually landed with employees, how communication gaps created resistance, how leaders' intentions got lost in translation as they moved down organizational hierarchies. He wrote analysis that Catherine would have dismissed as too focused on soft factors, but that Marcus valued as essential human insight. This is your strength, Marcus told him during a feedback session. Understanding the human dimension of organizational systems. You should develop this. Not everyone has this kind of intuitive grasp of how people actually respond to institutional change. 3 months into the program, Margaret called Ethan to her office for a midpoint evaluation. He sat across from her, more confident now than he'd been in their first meeting, but still carrying the awareness that his success remained provisional. Your rotation performance has been consistently solid, Margaret said, reviewing his evaluations on her tablet. Team Alpha rates you as highly collaborative with strong operational insight. Team Beta acknowledges your contribution despite initial skepticism. Team Gamma says you're exactly the perspective they needed. James is pleased with your development. She set down the tablet, looking at him directly. However, you still have a weakness that concerns me. You're better at supporting other people's work than driving your own initiatives. You contribute to projects but rarely lead them. You offer insights when asked but seldom assert them proactively. That's a limitation for someone being prepared for management. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Ethan had become comfortable as a valuable contributor, but he hadn't stepped into leadership. He'd found his place as the person who helped others succeed rather than the person who drove success directly. I don't know how to lead in this environment, Ethan admitted. I know how to lead a facilities crew. I don't know how to lead strategy professionals. Leadership isn't environment-specific, Margaret countered. It's having a vision, articulating it clearly, and mobilizing people toward it. You have vision. You see things others miss. You're developing the ability to articulate it. What you lack is the confidence to mobilize people toward your insights, instead of offering them as suggestions for someone else to adopt. She pulled up a document on her screen. For your final 3 months, you'll be assigned a capstone project, something you'll lead, not just contribute to. Something that requires you to take ownership of outcomes, not just support someone else's initiative. This is your chance to prove you can drive results, not just enable them. What's the project? Ethan asked, anxiety and anticipation mixing in his chest. You'll find out next week, Margaret said. But I'll tell you this. It's been specifically designed to leverage your unique perspective while stretching your capabilities. It will require everything you've learned and force you to develop what you haven't yet mastered. It will be uncomfortable. That's intentional. That evening, Ethan sat with Marcus doing homework at their kitchen table. Marcus working on arithmetic, Ethan reviewing notes from his rotations and preparing for whatever challenge Margaret was about to throw at him. The ordinary domesticity of the moment felt precious, grounding, a reminder of what he was building this new career for. Dad, Marcus said, looking up from his math worksheet, Mrs. Chen says you're doing really good at your new job. Mrs. Chen talks to you about my job? Ethan asked, amused. She says I should be proud of you because you're working really hard and helping important people, Marcus explained. Are you helping important people? Ethan thought about Team Alpha and the manufacturing facilities, about workers whose expertise had been dismissed until someone helped translate it into language that strategic leaders could hear. Thought about Team Beta and the acquisition analysis that had been improved by considering operational realities. Thought about Team Gamma and the change management insights that came from years of being on the receiving end of decisions made without input from the people they affected. I'm trying to help people whose importance wasn't being recognized, Ethan said finally, by helping the important people understand that everyone's contribution matters, even when it doesn't look like what they expect important contributions to look like. Marcus considered this with the serious focus he brought to concepts he was still processing. Like how you're important even though you used to clean things? Exactly like that, Ethan said, his throat tight with emotion at his son's ability to understand complexity through simple truth. I think that's a really good job, Dad, Marcus said, returning to his arithmetic with the settled confidence of a child whose father had provided a satisfactory answer. Ethan watched his son work through math problems with determined focus, pencil gripped carefully, brow furrowed in concentration, and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd walked out of an interview believing he'd killed his last chance. Now he was being prepared to lead strategic initiatives at a billion-dollar corporation, respected by colleagues who'd initially doubted him, recognized for contributions that came from seeing what others overlooked. The transformation should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt fragile, temporary, like something that could still be taken away if he made a wrong move or failed to meet expectations or simply stopped being useful in the particular way that had made him valuable. But Marcus was right. It was a really good job, and Ethan was determined to prove he deserved to keep it. Whatever Margaret's capstone project required, whatever leadership challenge she was preparing to throw at him, he would face it the way he'd faced everything else in this program. By showing up fully, by leveraging his unique perspective, by refusing to apologize for seeing the world differently than traditional business minds saw it. He'd walked through the door Claire Donovan had opened. Now he just had to prove he could build something lasting on the other side of it. The capstone project announcement came on a Tuesday morning in Margaret's office, with James present as well. Ethan sat across from them both, sensing that whatever was coming would define whether the past 4 months had been genuine transformation or just an extended audition that he was about to fail. Your capstone project, Margaret began without preamble, is to design and implement a frontline employee engagement initiative. Specifically, you'll develop a program that creates formal channels for operational staff, facilities, security, mailroom, reception, to provide input on company processes and policies that affect their work. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. You're asking me to build a system so people like I used to be can actually be heard? We're asking you to solve a problem the company has struggled with for years, James corrected. We have thousands of employees doing essential operational work who see inefficiencies, identify problems, and have solutions we never hear because there's no structured way for them to contribute beyond their immediate job functions. You'll design that structure, pilot it in 3 departments, measure its effectiveness, and present your findings to the executive leadership team. The executive leadership team, Ethan repeated, his anxiety spiking, as in Claire Donovan and the C-suite. As in the people who make decisions about whether initiatives like this get funded and scaled company-wide, Margaret said. This isn't a theoretical exercise, Mr. Brooks. If your program works, it becomes policy. If it fails, it confirms the skepticism that frontline workers don't have strategic insights worth formalizing. The stakes are considerable. Why me? Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Because you're the only person in this program who's actually been on the front line, James said bluntly. Because you understand both the operational reality and the strategic implications. Because this project requires someone who can bridge worlds that usually don't communicate effectively. And because if you can't lead a project that's this aligned with your lived experience, then we've misjudged your readiness for management roles. Margaret slid a folder across her desk. You have 3 months. You'll have a small budget for pilot implementation, access to HR resources for program design, and the authority to engage with any department that agrees to participate. You'll report progress to me weekly and to James bi-weekly. At the end of 3 months, you'll present to executive leadership. Questions? Ethan had 1,000 questions, but only one that mattered. What if the departments I need don't want to participate? What if the frontline workers don't trust a program designed by someone who's now in management? Then you'll have to convince them, Margaret said simply. Leadership is influence without authority. This is your chance to demonstrate you have it. The weight of the project settled over Ethan as he left Margaret's office with the folder clutched in his hand. This wasn't just about designing a program. It was about proving that people like him, people who'd spent years being invisible, actually had valuable perspectives worth institutionalizing. If he failed, he'd be confirming every bias that said janitors should stay janitors, that operational workers couldn't think strategically, that there was a reason some people stayed behind glass doors they only opened to clean. That evening, Ethan spread the project materials across his kitchen table while Marcus did homework beside him. The initial research was sobering. Multiple previous attempts at frontline engagement programs had failed, dismissed as either too bureaucratic to be useful or too informal to generate actionable insights. The challenge wasn't just designing something new, it was designing something that would actually work where others had failed. You look worried, Marcus observed, glancing up from his reading assignment. I'm working on something important, Ethan said. Something that could help a lot of people, but only if I do it right. Like how? Marcus asked, with the curiosity of a child who'd learned his father's work was interesting even when he didn't fully understand it. Like making sure people who do important work get to tell the bosses when they see problems, Ethan explained. So the bosses can fix things before they become big problems. That sounds easy, Marcus said, with the beautiful simplicity of someone who hadn't yet learned how complicated simple things could become. It should be, Ethan agreed. That's what I need to figure out. Why it's hard and how to make it easier. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into research with the intensity of someone who understood this was his defining test. He reviewed the failed programs, identifying patterns in what hadn't worked. He studied successful engagement models from other companies, looking for principles that might translate. He talked to people in HR, in operations, in strategy, gathering perspectives on what frontline engagement should accomplish and what obstacles prevented it. But the real research came when Ethan did something that felt both natural and transgressive. He went back to the night shift. He arrived at Donovan Industries at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, wearing jeans and a work shirt instead of his business professional attire, carrying coffee and donuts instead of briefcase and laptop. The night shift facilities crew was taking their break in the basement break room, the same room where Ethan had spent countless hours during his own shift. They looked up when he entered, their expressions shifting from surprise to cautious welcome. He recognized most of them: Carlos, who'd been there longer than Ethan; Maria, who managed inventory with meticulous precision; James, different James, not his mentor, who handled the complex mechanical systems; Yolanda, who coordinated the crew schedules. They'd been his colleagues, his team, his people. Brooks, Carlos said, standing to grip his hand firmly. Heard you went corporate on us. Got yourself a fancy desk job. Training program, Ethan corrected, setting down the coffee and donuts. Still trying to prove I belong there. Actually, that's why I'm here. I need your help. The wariness that had been building, the natural suspicion that he'd become one of them, one of the managers who made decisions without understanding operational reality, eased slightly at his admission of need. What kind of help? Maria asked, accepting coffee with a nod of thanks. Ethan explained the project, not in the corporate language he'd been learning, but in the direct, functional terms that made sense to people who valued substance over style. He needed to design a program that would let frontline workers share insights with management in ways that would actually be heard and acted on. He needed their input on what had prevented that from happening historically and what would make it work going forward. "You want to know why management never listens to us?" James asked, his skepticism evident. "Because they don't actually want to hear what we have to say. They want to feel like they asked, so they can check the box that says they engaged with employees. But when we tell them the air handling system on floor 12 needs replacing, not just patching, they thank us for our input and do nothing." "That's exactly what I need to prevent," Ethan said. "The program has to create actual accountability for response. It can't just be a suggestion box that gets ignored." "So you're asking us to trust that this time will be different?" Yolanda said, her tone making clear how many times different had turned out to be the same. "I'm asking you to help me design something that forces it to be different," Ethan replied. "I can't do this without input from people who actually know what it's like to have expertise that gets dismissed. I spent 6 years being that person. Now I have a chance to build a system that prevents it from happening to others, but I need you to tell me what that system should look like." The conversation that followed went until almost 2 a.m., long after Ethan should have left to get sleep before his morning meetings. They talked about all the times they'd identified problems that went unaddressed, all the ways their knowledge was devalued, all the structural barriers that prevented good information from reaching decision makers. But they also talked about what would make them trust a formal engagement process, transparency about how input was reviewed, clear accountability for response, recognition that didn't feel patronizing, actual changes that proved their insights had value. Carlos walked Ethan to the elevator when he finally left, the building quiet around them in that particular way of late night when even the city outside seemed to pause. "You really think you can pull this off?" Carlos asked. "Make them actually listen?" "I have to," Ethan said simply, "because if I can't, I'll have wasted the opportunity Claire Donovan gave me. And worse, I'll have confirmed everyone's assumption that people like us don't have strategic value." "People like us," Carlos repeated, then smiled slightly. "You still think of yourself as one of us, even with the desk job and the training program?" "I'll always be one of us," Ethan said. "I just have access to rooms now where I can make them hear us." The program he designed over the next month was built on the insights from that conversation and dozens of others like it. He called it the Operational Intelligence Initiative, a name suggested by Catherine from Team Beta, who pointed out that intelligence had military connotations of valuable information from the field, not just raw data. The structure was deliberately simple. Operational staff could submit insights through a digital platform with required response timelines for management. Submissions would be reviewed by cross-functional teams that included both strategic staff and operational representatives. Implemented suggestions would be recognized publicly, with credit going to the submitters. Most importantly, all submissions and responses would be tracked transparently, creating accountability that couldn't be quietly ignored. The challenge was finding departments willing to pilot it. Most managers, when Ethan approached them, were politely dismissive. They already had feedback mechanisms, they claimed. They already engaged with their staff. They didn't need a formal program creating additional administrative burden. Ethan kept hearing the subtext beneath their words. "We don't want frontline workers questioning our decisions or implying we've been missing important information." His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Robert Martinez, the Cleveland facility manager whose Operation Team Alpha had studied, agreed immediately when Ethan reached out. "You actually listen to my workers," Robert said during their video call. "You're the reason we're finally getting equipment replacement instead of being told to optimize our way out of obsolescence. If you're building a program to make that kind of listening systematic, I want my facility to be part of it." The second pilot department came from someone even more surprising, Patricia Hemsworth from HR, the woman who'd conducted his disastrous interview. She reached out to Ethan directly, requesting a meeting that he approached with careful neutrality, uncertain what to expect. They met in her office, the same space where she'd presumably filed paperwork dismissing him as unqualified months ago. She gestured for him to sit, her expression professional but carrying something that looked like genuine respect. I've been following your progress through the training program, Patricia said without preamble. Margaret shares participant updates with relevant stakeholders. I wanted to tell you directly, I was wrong about you. Not just wrong in judgment, but wrong in the assumptions I used to reach that judgment. I appreciate that, Ethan said carefully, not sure where this was going. Your capstone project, Patricia continued, is exactly the kind of initiative HR should have been driving for years. We've failed to create meaningful engagement with operational staff because we've approached it bureaucratically rather than authentically. I'd like HR to be a pilot department, if you'll have us. Why? Ethan asked bluntly. Not to be difficult, but why now? Why this program? Patricia was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Because 6 months ago I dismissed a highly qualified candidate based on criteria that measured appearance over ability, and I did it believing I was applying reasonable professional standards. Your success in the training program has forced me to question those standards. If I was that wrong about you, how many other talented people have I screened out using the same flawed criteria? This program is a chance to systematically surface talent and insight we've been missing because we weren't asking the right questions or listening to the right voices. The third pilot came from James Chen's own strategy and operations department, which surprised Ethan until James explained his reasoning. If this program works, strategy will be informed by operational reality in real time instead of always playing catch-up. If it fails, better to discover that in a controlled pilot than after company-wide implementation. Either way, we learned something valuable. With 3 pilot departments confirmed, Ethan spent the next 6 weeks implementing the program with meticulous attention to detail. He trained managers on how to review and respond to submissions. He met with operational staff to explain the system, and more importantly, to convince them their input would actually matter this time. He built tracking mechanisms that made accountability visible. He established review committees that included both strategic and operational voices. The submissions started slowly, operational staff testing whether this was real or just another performance of engagement. But when the first few submissions received genuine responses, when a facility's workers' insight about HVAC efficiency led to an actual policy change, when a security guard's observation about traffic flow patterns informed a visitor management redesign, momentum built. By week 8, Ethan had real data. 47 submissions across 3 departments. 38 had received substantive responses within the required timeframe. 12 had led to implemented changes. 3 had identified problems that would have become expensive failures if left unaddressed. The program was working, not perfectly, but demonstrably better than the informal systems it replaced. His weekly meetings with Margaret became presentations of progress rather than defensive explanations of obstacles. His bi-weekly sessions with James shifted from anxious check-ins to strategic discussions of how to scale the program if executive leadership approved it. The other participants in the training program, Jessica, Rachel, Thomas, David, Allison, all successful in their own capstone projects, began treating him not as the unlikely candidate, but as an equal contributor to their cohort. But the real test was still coming. The presentation to executive leadership was scheduled for the final week of the program, and Ethan spent every spare moment preparing for it with the intensity of someone who understood this would define his entire trajectory. Marcus noticed his father's stress, approaching it with the direct concern of a child who'd learned to read his parents' moods. "Is your big presentation soon?" he asked one evening while Ethan practiced in front of the bathroom mirror. "End of the week," Ethan confirmed, adjusting his tie for the dozenth time. "I'm presenting to the people who run the whole company, including the lady who gave me this chance." "The boss lady who ran after you?" Marcus remembered, his eyes wide. "That's cool. Are you going to tell her you did a good job?" "I'm going to show her," Ethan said, "with data and results and evidence that the program works." "But you're also going to tell her," Marcus insisted, with the certainty of someone who believed in the power of words. "Because sometimes people need to hear things, not just see them." The presentation was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. in the executive boardroom on the 24th floor. Ethan arrived at 1:30, giving himself time to set up and breathe and combat the anxiety that threatened to manifest as visible nervousness. The room was intimidating in its corporate elegance. Polished table, leather chairs, screens on every wall, the entire city visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Margaret arrived first, offering a brief nod of encouragement. Then James, taking a seat near the back with the deliberate positioning of someone who wanted to observe without influencing. The other executive leadership team members filed in: the CFO, COO, Chief People Officer, several senior VPs whose titles Ethan had memorized, but whose faces he recognized only from company communications. And finally, Claire Donovan, entering with the calm authority of someone whose presence commanded attention without requiring announcement. She took her seat at the head of the table, her eyes meeting Ethan's briefly with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Brooks," she said, her voice clear and direct, "you have 30 minutes to present your capstone project. We'll hold questions until the end." Ethan stood, connected his laptop to the presentation system, and felt every hour of preparation settling into his muscles like muscle memory. He'd practiced this presentation 50 times, had refined every slide, had anticipated every question. But standing here in front of the people who would determine his future, all of that preparation felt simultaneously essential and completely inadequate. "For 6 years," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, "I worked night shift facilities maintenance in this building. During that time, I identified dozens of operational inefficiencies, safety concerns, and process improvements. I reported some of them through informal channels. Most of them I kept to myself because there was no formal mechanism to share operational insights with strategic decision makers, and because I understood that my perspective wasn't valued beyond my immediate job function." He clicked to the next slide, showing data on the cost of missed operational insights. Research across multiple industries shows that frontline workers identify problems an average of 3 to 6 months before they become visible to management. When those early warnings are ignored or never reach decision makers, problems become crises and crises become expensive failures. The question isn't whether frontline workers have valuable operational intelligence. The question is whether we're systematically capturing it or systematically wasting it. The presentation walked through the program design, the pilot implementation, the results from 3 departments. He showed examples of submissions that had prevented problems, of operational insights that had improved efficiency, of small course corrections that had saved significant money. He presented the data without embellishment, letting results speak for themselves. But when he reached the section on scalability and recommendations, Ethan made a choice. Instead of just presenting the strategic rationale, he told stories. He talked about Carlos, who'd identified a pattern in equipment failures that predicted expensive breakdowns. About Maria, whose inventory management insight had eliminated waste in supply ordering. About a security guard named Ramon, who'd noticed patterns in after-hours badge access that revealed an unauthorized project team working without proper safety protocols. "These aren't just efficiency gains," Ethan said, meeting Claire's eyes directly. "These are people who've been doing valuable thinking without being recognized for it. This program isn't charity or morale building. It's operational intelligence gathering that taps into expertise we're already paying for but systematically ignoring. The ROI is significant, but more than that, it's the right way to respect the people who make this company function." He clicked to his final slide, recommendations for company-wide implementation with estimated costs, timeline, and projected benefits. "I'm recommending we expand this program across all operational departments over the next year. The initial investment is modest. The potential return, both financial and cultural, is substantial. And the cost of not doing it, of continuing to waste the operational intelligence of thousands of employees, is something we can no longer afford." The silence when he finished felt enormous. Ethan stood at the front of the room, his presentation complete, his case made, his future hanging on how these people would respond to his argument that invisible workers deserve to be heard. Claire spoke first. "Questions for Mr. Brooks?" The CFO raised his hand. "The tracking system you've designed, what prevents it from becoming an administrative burden that creates more problems than it solves?" Ethan had anticipated this question. "The system is intentionally lightweight. Submissions are limited to 200 words. Required responses are acknowledgement within 48 hours. Substantive response within 2 weeks. That's not burdensome. It's accountability. And the data from our pilot shows that rapid response actually reduces administrative burden by addressing problems before they escalate into issues requiring extensive management attention. The COO followed with a harder question. You've shown success in 3 departments, but those were departments that volunteered for the pilot. They were already inclined to value frontline input. How do you scale this to departments that are skeptical or resistant? By making it mandatory, not optional, Ethan replied, knowing this would be controversial. The departments most resistant to frontline input are usually the ones that need it most. They're where operational intelligence is being most systematically ignored, which means they're accumulating blind spots that will become expensive problems. We can't allow managers to opt out of listening to their teams any more than we'd allow them to opt out of financial reporting or safety compliance. Several executives looked surprised by the directness of his answer. Claire's expression remained neutral, but Ethan thought he saw a slight nod of approval. The chief people officer, a woman named Dr. Sandra Kim, spoke up thoughtfully. This program challenges traditional hierarchical structures by giving frontline workers direct channels to strategic leadership. How do you prevent that from undermining middle management authority? This question went to the heart of the resistance Ethan had encountered. Middle management authority comes from their ability to coordinate, make decisions, and drive results. This program doesn't undermine that. It gives them better information to do their jobs effectively. Managers who are threatened by frontline input are usually managers who've been making decisions without adequate operational understanding. This program helps them succeed by connecting them to reality. Strong managers will appreciate that. Weak managers will resist it. We should design for the managers we want, not the ones we're afraid of losing. There was a moment of charged silence, and Ethan realized he might have pushed too hard, been too direct about management inadequacy. But Claire was smiling now, an expression of satisfaction that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of clarity. "Any other questions?" she asked, scanning the table. When no one spoke up, she turned to Ethan. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. Excellent work. Please wait outside while we deliberate." Ethan gathered his materials and left the boardroom with legs that felt slightly unsteady from adrenaline come down. He found a bench in the hallway and sat, trying to process what had just happened. He'd presented his case. He'd answered their questions. He'd been as honest as he knew how to be about what the program meant and why it mattered. Now the decision was out of his hands. Margaret emerged from the boardroom 15 minutes later, her expression carefully neutral. "They're ready for you." Ethan walked back into the room, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The executive team was still seated, Claire at the head of the table, her posture relaxed but her attention complete. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "we've reviewed your proposal. The executive team is unanimous in approving company-wide implementation of the Operational Intelligence Initiative. Dr. Kim will work with you on scaling logistics. The CFO will allocate budget. The COO will mandate participation across all operational departments. You've made a compelling case for something we should have done years ago." Relief flooded through Ethan, profound enough that he had to focus on keeping his expression professional instead of letting it show the emotional weight of what her words meant. But Claire wasn't finished. "However, we need someone to lead this program as it scales. Someone who understands both the operational and strategic dimensions. Someone who can navigate the political resistance while maintaining the program's integrity. Margaret and James believe you're ready for that role." "I'm inclined to agree." She paused, letting the implication settle. "We're offering you a full-time position as Director of Operational Intelligence, reporting directly to the COO. You'll have a team, a budget, and the authority to implement this initiative across the company. You'll also complete the executive training program, which means you'll be eligible for future advancement into senior operations leadership. The salary is commensurate with director-level positions. The benefits include the comprehensive health coverage you've needed. Is this something you're interested in?" Ethan stood there trying to process what she was offering. Not just approval of his program, not just completion of the training program, but an actual director-level position, the kind of role that 6 months ago would have seemed impossibly beyond his reach. "Yes," he said, his voice carrying emotions he couldn't entirely suppress. "Absolutely, yes." "Good," Claire said, standing to shake his hand across the table. Her grip was firm, her expression approving. "You've earned this, Mr. Brooks. Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise. Now go start building your team." The other executives offered congratulations as they filed out, Margaret providing details about next steps and timeline, James promising support in the transition. But Ethan barely processed the specifics, too overwhelmed by the reality of what had just happened. He'd done it. He'd not just completed the program, he'd created something lasting that would make the company better. He'd proven that his perspective had value, that his unconventional path had given him insights worth institutionalizing. He'd earned a position where he could continue the work of making invisible people visible. That evening, Ethan came home to find Mrs. Chen and Marcus had made a celebratory dinner. His son launched himself at him the moment he walked through the door, already having heard some version of good news. "Did you get the job?" Marcus demanded. "Mrs. Chen said you were presenting to all the bosses. Did they like it?" "They loved it," Ethan said, picking up his son despite the weight that was getting harder to lift. "And they offered me a really important job. I'm going to be a director. That means I get to lead a whole department and help a lot of people." "Will you still be home at night?" Marcus asked, cutting straight to what mattered most to him. "I'll be home at night," Ethan promised, "and I'll have better insurance for your medicine, and we'll be able to move to a bigger apartment eventually, and maybe—" He paused, meeting his son's hopeful eyes. "Maybe in a few months we can talk about getting that dog you wanted." Marcus's whoop of joy was loud enough to probably disturb the neighbors, but Ethan didn't care. He held his son and felt the weight of 6 months of struggle and growth and transformation settle into something that felt like earned stability. Later, after Marcus fell asleep and Mrs. Chen had left with Ethan's profound thanks and a promise of a substantial bonus from his new salary, Ethan sat alone in his kitchen with a glass of cheap wine that he'd been saving for an occasion that merited celebration. He thought about the morning he'd walked out of that interview, choosing dignity over desperation. Thought about Claire Donovan running after him, seeing something in him that he'd stopped seeing in himself. Thought about the months of training where every day had been a battle against his own certainty that he didn't belong. Thought about the allies he'd found, the skills he'd developed, the confidence he'd slowly built through evidence of his own capability. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Director Brooks has a nice ring to it. Drinks next week to celebrate?" Another text from Rachel. "Congratulations. You earned the hell out of this." One from Jessica. "Proud to have been in your cohort. You're going to do amazing things." And finally one from James Chen. "I told Margaret you were ready. Glad you proved us both right. Don't be a stranger." Ethan responded to each of them, feeling the genuine connection that had developed over months of shared struggle. They'd all completed the program successfully. Jessica heading to strategic operations, Rachel to security leadership, Thomas to business development, David to technical integration, Allison to corporate strategy. They'd all found their places, had all proven themselves in different ways. But Ethan's victory felt different, carried a weight that wasn't just personal. He'd proven that excellence came from unexpected places, that traditional credentials weren't the only pathway to strategic contribution, that people who'd been invisible could become essential if someone actually bothered to look. On Monday, Ethan Brooks walked through the front door of Donovan Industries for his first day as Director of Operational Intelligence. He carried himself differently now, not with the desperate determination of someone trying to prove he deserved to be there, but with the earned confidence of someone who'd already proven it. He took the elevator to the 16th floor where his new office was located. Not a corner office, but a real office with his name on the door and his title beneath it. Inside was a desk, a computer, a whiteboard waiting for his strategic planning. The view looked out over the city, showing him a perspective he'd never imagined having. But before he settled into his new role, Ethan took a detour. He went down to the basement break room where the night shift facilities crew would be finishing their shift. Carlos looked up in surprise when Ethan walked in, still wearing his suit but carrying coffee and donuts like he had months ago. "Director Brooks," Carlos said with a grin. "Too fancy for us now." "Never," Ethan replied, setting down the coffee. "I'm here because I need your help. I'm building a team to run the operational intelligence program. I need someone who understands facilities operations, who knows how to communicate with frontline workers, who won't let corporate politics compromise the program's integrity. Interested?" Carlos stared at him. "You're offering me a job?" A management job? I'm offering you a chance to prove you're more than what your current job title suggests, Ethan corrected. Same chance someone gave me. You've been here longer than I was, you've got institutional knowledge I don't have, and you understand the barriers that prevent operational intelligence from reaching decision makers because you've lived them. That makes you qualified. The question is whether you're interested. Hell yes, I'm interested, Carlos said, standing to shake his hand firmly. When do I start? Same process I went through, Ethan said. Application, interview, training program. But I can tell you that you're exactly what this program needs. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. As Ethan left the break room and headed back upstairs to begin his first day, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been a janitor who was told he didn't fit the professional image the company wanted. Now he was a director with the authority to change what professional looked like, to expand who got recognized and valued, to build systems that made invisible people impossible to ignore. The transformation hadn't been easy. It had required learning a new language, developing new skills, pushing past his own certainty that he didn't belong. It had required allies who'd seen past his unconventional background to recognize his legitimate capabilities. It had required Claire Donovan choosing accountability over convenience, Margaret Foster pushing him past his self-imposed limitations, James Chen believing his perspective had value worth developing. But most of all, it had required Ethan believing in himself, believing that competence wasn't defined by credentials but by contribution, believing that his path, unconventional as it was, had given him insights worth offering, believing that walking away from that interview with his dignity intact had been the right choice, even when it felt like throwing away his last chance. He settled into his new office, logged into his new computer, and pulled up the implementation plan for scaling the Operational Intelligence Initiative. There was work to do, teams to build, resistance to overcome, skeptics to convince. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But Ethan Brooks was ready. Not because he'd stopped being afraid, but because he'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing the work anyway, showing up fully, refusing to let doubt define his limits. That evening, he texted his son. "Dad didn't give up, and neither will you." The response came quickly. "I know, Dad. You're the bravest person I know." Ethan stared at those words, feeling their weight and their truth. He'd walked into that interview room months ago believing he had nothing to offer beyond desperation. He'd walked out knowing he had something more valuable: dignity, competence, and the courage to keep pushing forward even when doors closed in his face. Now those doors were open. Now he stood on the other side, exactly where he'd earned the right to be. Not because someone had felt sorry for him, not because he'd been given charity, but because he'd proven, through months of relentless effort and growth, that excellence came from unexpected places when someone actually bothered to look. He closed his laptop, looked out his office window at the city spreading below, and smiled. This was just the beginning. There were thousands of people still invisible, still waiting for someone to recognize their worth, still doing essential work without being valued for it. Ethan Brooks had been one of them. Now he was in a position to make sure they were seen, and he would spend every day of his career making sure that doors stayed open, that voices stayed heard, that people who'd been dismissed for not fitting someone's image got the chance to prove that competence mattered more than appearances. Because he knew, better than most, what it meant to finally be recognized for who you'd always been capable of becoming. The janitor who'd refused to beg had become the director who would make sure no one had to. And that transformation, earned through struggle and validated through results, was the most powerful kind of success there was. The kind that changed not just one person's trajectory, but the entire system that had tried to keep him invisible. Ethan Brooks had walked through the door, and he was leaving it open behind him.